This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
If any apologies have been received for this morning's meeting.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies for absence today from Assemblymember Clark and Assemblymember Rogers, and Assemblymember Ahmad is attending as a substitute and she'll be here shortly.
Excellent. Okay, that was item 1. Item 2 is declarations of interests. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare?
Noted.
Excellent. Item 3, summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions from previous meetings of the committee? Noted. Excellent. And we now move to item 4, which is our main item of business, a discussion following the 2022-23 Greater London Authority Group outturn. First part of the meeting will focus on the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, or MOPAC. The second part of the meeting will focus on Transport for London, and the third part of the meeting on the Greater London Authority. I'm anticipating a roughly even set of thirds, I think, for those 3 parts of the meeting. So, if I may, I'd like to welcome our first panel of guests. We have Amana Humayun. Is that the correct pronunciation of your name? Excellent. Okay. She is Chief Finance Officer at the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. Good morning, Amana. And we also have Ian Percival, who's Director of Finance at the Metropolitan Police Service. Good morning, Ian. So, if I lead off with the first question, if I may, we're looking at the Metropolitan Police Capital Programme, first little bit this morning. So there's been a long-running situation at the Met of the capital programme being underspent. I think we're now in year 5, and it sort of would be year 6 if it hadn't been for the large purchase of a building in West London, which wasn't planned but did bring the spending up to par. So what lessons have you learnt from sort of that, what is now a pattern of 5/6 years of the capital spend being less than the budget? I don't know if you want to start, Ian.
Thank you. Yeah. So yes, I mean, I was sitting here this time last year when we had a similar question, and we recognised that I think we are possibly a little bit too ambitious in some of our planning in certain areas, and some of the timings, what we're trying to land is, it's not that we're not doing things, it's that our estimate of timing, things are moving slightly to the right. Now, there have been reasons for that. So if you look at our capital programme broadly around digital policing, fleet, those are broadly in line with the budget, and we did quite a lot of scrutiny on that as we set the budget, and we sort of took initial estimates, and then we made some reductions for optimism bias. The areas where we've got the big underspends are property, which a lot of that is linked to the revamp of the estates strategy. The new commissioners obviously came in and wants us to look again at the plans for estates, so that has put some slowdown to our original plans. And then in transformation, we've got 2 sort of major IT projects that are running for Connect and Command and Control, both of which have had some slippage, which has therefore moved money into the to the right. So in terms of what we're doing about it, again for this year, as we're as we're going into the budget cycle for next year, we set up a number of internal scrutiny panels that we'll be running. MOPAC will be part of that, and we will be drilling in as, you know, we've done this before. It's not that we haven't gone into the detail, but we will be drilling into a lot more detail and being a lot more ruthless is probably a bit too strong, but a lot stronger about setting the original budget and the challenge on the timings.
So, yeah, I suppose that the context. I'm flicking back over my page to my little bar chart that's been produced here, which shows each year, you know, budget versus actual, and it's a big old miss, and it's every single year. And I suppose what I'm thinking is probably my predecessor, who's actually sitting just there, and you know, his predecessor and predecessor before him probably have sat here and heard a similar story. And I suppose what I feel bound to say is, you know, you've given us explanations of what's going on this year, but obviously this is year, depending on how you look at the Emperor State Building purchase, 5/6 years of significance. So this year, well, the year just finished is, where are we? 32% down. So 269 million budget. Where are we? So 126 million down on the original budget, and then 53 million on the revised budget. So that's a big old gap. And I suppose what you know, I feel bound to point out is that obviously officers doing their job, I dare say if we brought some officers in here, or perhaps could anonymously interview them, they'd tell us about all the equipment and the kit that they don't have that they really would like to have. and I'm sitting here looking at a paper that tells me that there's 138 million quid of money to buy kit that hasn't been spent, year after year. So I don't know, in terms of the processes, you sort of told us about being more ruthless. I don't object to being ruthless where there's continuous failure. But what exactly is it, do you think, that makes it, it's not 1 year, one project, it's 5, 6 years, many projects?
Yeah. Candidly, I share your frustration because obviously I'm putting together the budget, but actually there would probably be a number of other people who could explain in quite a lot more detail why there is some slippage in certain areas. Well, what are we doing differently? Well, I mean, the process we have in place, which is we scrutinise and we reset every 6 months, and then we do a formal reset every year as part of the budget process, is sound. But as in the process is sound, what we perhaps need to be, to go back to my earlier point, what we need to be is much more, in certain areas, just more challenging. And I think for this time, and Amana will take a view as we do this with MOPAC, there'll be a bit more of a finance overlay on the budget that we set, and we will take a lot more account of optimism in some of the planning.
Yeah. See, that's, I suppose what the thought that's on my mind is that, all the way back in the 1970s, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman did some research about why people constantly misestimate how long things will take, and they consistently estimate that it'll be quicker than they think, and then it isn't. And so there's really decades of research into how you can overcome that. And so I suppose what I'd like to hear is how some of those quite well-established principles of how you take the optimism out, because that's the problem, is that people go, oh yeah, we reckon that'll take 6 months, and then 9 months later you're still halfway through. What actual process changes are there to actually sort of to realign how long you think it will take with how long it will actually take? So one of them, for example, is benchmarking against other projects. You say other similar projects took about that long. We don't think ours will take that long, and then what you'll find is it probably does.
Yeah, I think, if I may, I think if we look back over this, it's not to make excuses, but if you look back over the years, we've entered into a transformation project. We entered into significant estates transformation and some major IT projects. We're now well established within those projects. So if I look at transformation, I look at Connect and Command and Control, there has definitely been some slippage, but we are therefore reworking the full business case. We are and reassessing those costs in light of the learning from the previous couple of years. So that we're in a slightly different position. So it's not like we're embarking on a project. We are midway through a project, which means we've got to learn a lot of learning from what's happened, and we can sort of reassess the costs accordingly. On the wider digital stuff, to your earlier point around kit, I mean, we have rolled out a lot of kits. We've rolled out the phones, and we've got quite a good rhythm around the sort of normal IT. Challenge will be around the property at the moment, and we just need to land exactly what we're doing around estates, and once we've got that lined up, then we will be able to take a sort of better view around the timing.
So just since you mentioned estates, I wasn't going to ask, but I feel now bound to ask. When do you think we might see it? This year?
I'm going to defer that one.
I thought you might know. That was an unfair question. Sorry, Amana, you wanted to come in.
If I may, just to give
sorry, there's a little button on the front with like a little person with some sound waves coming out. Perfect.
How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, come on.
If I may, just to provide the MOPAC perspective. So I think I absolutely hear what you're saying, Chair, that everyone in your position over the past number of years has raised a similar challenge. I do think it's relevant that over the past 12 months, it's almost 12 months now, there's been a significant leadership change in the organisation. There's been a whole number of events, inspections, reports that are leading to, I think, one of the biggest reform programmes that the Met has encountered in its history. That's having an impact on things like the estate strategy. So I do, whilst I hear that you probably hear excuses and reasons every year, I do feel that this is a slightly unprecedented moment.
I think I did use the word reasons. I hope I didn't say excuses. Maybe it was in my mind.
I think there's another kind of honest conversation that we're having with the Met around the organisation's capacity to deal with change, actually. And I think capital spend, basically, a lot of it represents transformation, doesn't it? So whether it's the large digital programs that Ian's referring to or changes on the estates front, I think we are asking the Met to really think about, is there just an internal capacity constraint in terms of how quickly you can spend these sorts of sums? And if you think about all of the change that's underway in the Met, as I say, the reform, the impact on the estate strategy, do we just need to be less ambitious in terms of how much we're going to do on the capital spend front? We haven't got an answer to that question yet, but we are asking that question, and we haven't asked that in previous years. Ian's already referred to the change in terms of scrutiny panels that we've put in place for this financial year. So previously there was a capital scrutiny exercise at the start of the financial year in coming up with the budget for the following year, and also at the mid-year point. Actually, I think for capital spend, given how long it can take to mobilise, the mid-year point is probably a bit too late. So the Met are now going to be doing that on a quarterly basis and having MOPAC in the room to help with the kind of oversight and the scrutiny. And the last thing, which again I know that Ian's just referred to in passing, there were a number of areas of capital commitment in the Commissioner's 100-day plan, and they've been delivered. So rolling out a mobile technology to every single officer, that was delivered, and it was delivered quickly. We have a fairly lengthy governance process and sign-off process. I think you know that the scheme of delegation for the Met is only 500k, so everything in excess of 500k has to come to MOPAC and ultimately be signed by Sophie as Deputy Mayor. And we went through that process at, I think, maximum speed to allow the tech to be rolled out, and also the rollout of defib kits and bleed kits to all frontline officers. So that's also happened. So there is some movement in the capital area.
Okay, well, I look forward, if I'm here next year, obviously we have an election between here and this time next year, but maybe if I'm back, there'll be lots of really good news about how we are on track. I mean, I should say my question should not be taken as implying that you should just throw money out the door in order to hit a target. So what you're describing, I think, a process of establishing what you want to achieve and then a plan to achieve it is much better than just buying a fan and some banknotes and opening a window. In terms of the underspend that there is that's from the year, obviously we're looking at the year just ended. Where are we with is there an ability to recover that capital, the unspent capital from last year? Are you able to roll that over into those projects?
So effectively, yes.
Okay.
So, I mean, at the end of each, what it means in practical terms is we borrow less. So we plan to borrow a certain amount of money. We've spent less than that, therefore we borrow less. We've still got ambition, so that we reset the programme that includes rolling things forward, and then we reset the financing accordingly.
Okay, so the money isn't lost, I suppose, is my question.
No,
good.
No.
Okay, and in terms of the frontline services, is there an impact on frontline services of the projects that are delayed or behind schedule or reprogrammed or reprofiled or whatever word we'd like to use?
Well, as Amana said, and as we've said, we have rolled out. Sort of kit has been rolled out. I think there's a delay. So there's a delay in the new command and control, and there's been a delay to the next drop of Connect. So the impact is still operating on the old systems rather than having the benefit of the new system, rather than missing, not having something, if that makes sense. We're just operating as we were. We've got something that will bring benefit, but that's taken a bit longer than we'd planned.
So the delay is a big, in terms of frontline impact, the delay to the delay to the IT rollout, that's probably the big one, is it? The big noticeable impact?
Yeah, so I would have thought, based on what's in the capital programme, that it's that, and it's basically therefore delaying the benefits that come from having that improved system.
Okay. I'm told here that you told this committee last year, I'm afraid I wasn't on this committee last year, but that there was increased risk because of operating on those older platforms. You're happy that the risk of that is being managed?
Well, that's what, I mean, the IT guys are managing the risk. Obviously, there is a risk as we have, as the older platforms and as services go out of date and become older, there is a risk. And it's very much, the project team and the SROs that's introducing Connect are very much alive to that.
Okay, and then sort of final bit on looking back. If you anticipate slippage in projects, I think you've perhaps already just answered this, but you don't return the funds back to the GLA. Effectively, the budget that you've allocated, if it slips, you retain the budget and can keep that capital funds available.
Yeah, I mean, we get no grant for capital, so we have to generate all of the money from other sources, and we either get we get specific funding for certain projects, like your CTP HQ. There's counter-terrorism funding that supports that. We have receipts from selling buildings, or we have to borrow. We use the specific funding and we use the receipts, and then we just reduce the borrowing. So there's no money to give back. We just don't borrow as much.
More of a treasury impact, I suppose, than a budget impact as such. Okay. So looking forward, so based on how things went last year, how do you anticipate things going for the year just starting 23-24? Perhaps, Ian, if you can. Because that's the question, I suppose, that we'll be answering this time next year.
Yeah, and I'm not going to set myself up as a hostage, unfortunately. I mean, we are right slap bang in the middle of doing our first formal forecast based on the Q. So we always do our first process at Q1, so based on the figures at the end of June. So I'm not in a position to say how I think it will look this year. We have been through this enough. You've questioned me. Trust me, we go through this enough times internally as well that I would sincerely hope that what I see is a lot closer to the budget. But if you're asking me this question in about 10 days' time, I'd actually have the figures in front of me. But I'm afraid for the first quarter assessment, I just don't have them at the moment.
I'd be quite happy then. I mean, I'd rather have a good number than. So I don't know if you could write to us, if you write back to the committee in, let's say 11 days. I'll give you a day for postage.
If I could make a request, you will get that through the quarterly performance report, so that it will automatically be in the MOPAC performance report that comes out, I think, 35 working days at the end of the quarter. So the detail will be in there.
Okay, and in terms of the risks, excuse me, in terms of the risks in that capital budget for the year ahead, at the risk of repeating the dreaded E word with the estate strategy, which I appreciate is not it's not within your gift to announce, but assuming that that's one of the risks, is about at what point that's confirmed and what's in it, which is a known unknown, if you like. What else is in there that you think is potentially potential cause of delay or risk or uncertainty?
I mean, the estates is probably the one that's the main issue, because Connect, excuse me, for example, Drop 2 is aiming to happen this financial year, and we've got a lot more detail on the costs and the timing for those programs. So I think it's mainly what happens around estates, whilst we are finalising, to meet the Commissioner's ambition, and then ultimately the updated estate strategy.
Okay, that's we look forward to to breaking your run of form. Let's all look forward to that. So if I could ask you, Amana, so from MOPAC's point of view, what's the work that you sort of hinted a bit at this earlier, but what's the work that you're doing to support and to challenge MPS on this? Because obviously you'll have seen the same figures that we see and presumably asked similar questions.
Yes, that's exactly right. We are quite closely involved in the area of transformation. We are now working quite closely with the programme teams that are working on the two programmes that Ian referred to, so Command and Control and Connect. It really helps to have just a more forensic level of understanding of the reasons for some of the delays they're encountering. And just to be able to influence their thinking a little bit without kind of overstepping the line away from oversight. I think participating in the scrutiny sessions is also going to be something significantly different from anything we've done previously. So where, frankly, we identify optimism bias and don't believe forecasts, will be a lot more challenging in terms of accepting those forecasts. And I think the third area is encouraging the Met to consider in-year reallocations. The challenge is that the budgets for capital will eventually be spent. These aren't underspends as such, it's just slippage. So we just need to strike the right balance between appropriately reallocating to areas where we can spend in year and it's a priority, and not losing out money on essential capital works that are ultimately going to happen just a bit more later than planned.
So presumably, I mean, one of the things I was interested in is obviously, it's a pattern now, 5/6 years, depending on how you count it. So what's MOPAC doing differently? I think you've sort of hinted at that the main thing you're doing differently is just to be more assertive. Is that right? Just to sort of to be more assertive at saying we don't think that's realistic, that's too much, too quickly, or what besides that? What else are you doing?
I think getting a more granular insight into the delivery of programs. I don't think we've been as closely involved as we currently are on things like connect and command and control. As an example, we met with a key supplier of one of those two programs because we were dissatisfied at the MOPAC and deputy mayor level at their progress, which was having a direct impact on costs. So that's one example of actually having interactions with suppliers to explain our role as the oversight body and how fundamental the supplier's delivery is in basically supporting policing for Londoners. So that's another example of what we're doing differently.
Okay. Has ever been, just a final question, has it ever been suggested that the total budget is too large and that there's just too much money beyond the capacity of what they need or can deliver? Specifically on the capital budget.
I think the question is around the capacity point is now being raised. I don't think we've raised it before. I don't think there's anything gold-plated about the Met's capital programme. I mean, we're talking about, and you're welcome to visit all the police stations across London. Some of the refurbishment, some of the work that's required is just to bring stations up to an adequate level. The command and control and connect systems are to replace, in some instances, some really old technology. I don't think I'd be wrong in saying 70s and 80s software that we're using. So I don't think it's too big in that respect. I think just with all the various aspects of change underway at the Met, there is a question being asked about just the capacity to deliver some transformational capital change alongside the ongoing reform as well at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about the kinds of things that are happening in stations. So Croydon Police Station just had a refurb. It's not a gold-plated refurb. It brings it up to a reasonable standard. And I was thinking, one of the things that came out in the Casey review was this now infamous evidence fridge that was sort of completely dilapidated. I mean, that's an example of, if you've got, 138 million underspend on your capital and you can't buy a new fridge, that feels like a capacity problem, not a budget problem, isn't it? There is money in the kitty to buy a new fridge if the fridge is dying. So I mean,
agree with that. Yeah.
I mean, is that the sort? Has there been a look at that kind of what can seem quite low-level issue, Ian, about things like sort of basics that officers are working with day to day? That is sort of a capital spend, and probably the way that it feels to them is, there's no money, and the way that it looks to us is there's loads of money and somehow we can't spend it.
I mean, that's the role of we have our property services department, and we have sort of building managers in our key buildings, and part of their role is obviously to make sure that we get buildings to the appropriate standards. So they are looking at all sorts of levels, not just at the new buildings, but as Amana says, bringing everything to a reasonable standard.
Okay.
And can I just add one more thing?
You can, yeah. I'm finished. So whatever you say is going to be the last thing before I hand on to the next.
So it's just to do your point. The point Amana's raised about this capacity to deliver and capacity to receive as well. And one of the things that we are looking at, if you look at the spend over the last few, as you pointed out, the last few, if you take ESB out, it's floating at around the 250, 270 mark. So one of the things we are looking at and will be when we set the next budget is realistically, we've got 5 years of data that says that's probably what we can achieve, both in terms of spend and what the organisation can receive. So we'd probably look in that as a sort of benchmark, we wouldn't want to be going too far away from that for the next financial year.
Okay, that's useful. That was the end of my questions. Assembly Member Pidgeon, I believe, has a question.
Yes, that's right. I just wanted to delve into this transformation capital budget underspend of around 34 million. Is that specifically the connect and command and control programmes, or are there any other programmes around transforming the Met's culture? and therefore the slippage in these programmes may be having an impact on the wider culture issue in the Met, which we're all concerned about.
On last year's outturn, the majority of that slippage was the command and control project. I think about 30 million of that slippage was because a reassessment of the costs and moving things to the right. That takes up the lion's share of the transformation underspend. I think Connect was much smaller. It's about 3 million or something.
So that basically covers that whole pot. So there's no other sort of projects around transforming culture that may have slipped.
Not within that.
Not within that line.
capital programme.
Lovely.
No.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember Pigeon. Assemblymember Ahmad, I believe you had a question as well on this section.
Thank you, Chair. My apologies for lateness this morning. Good morning, panel. Can you explain to the committee what the difference between your transformation cost category is and your digital cost category is, please?
Yeah, most of the transformation was, we set up the category of transformation a few years ago when we embarked on our transformation programme, and it's mainly made, at the moment, it's the major projects, as I've said, are the Connect and Command and Control. The digital is more about the sort of business as usual IT, or the role, we talked about the rollout of mobile phones, for example, or tablets or laptops or ongoing system support. That's more in the digital space.
Thank you. You talked, we've talked today about slippage, and I saw that in your Q4 performance report that there is the slippage of command and control, which we've talked about. That report also talks about LNS calls improving, but they're still below target levels. And likewise for 999 calls, in March 2023, only 68% of calls were answered under 10 seconds, which is the target. Is that performance in any way linked to the slippage of the command and control spending?
I can't answer in huge detail on that, but no, I don't think it's linked. It's linked to, we are seeing an increased volume in calls, so it's not linked to the command and control project per se. But beyond that, I don't have a lot more detail on that.
Could you go and find out some detail? Because these are quite significant targets, and I think you'd probably agree that 68% in terms of a 999 call is not a good figure at the moment, particularly given where we are with the Met and the various criticisms that are laid at the Met, as you know. Could we have that in writing, that level of detail? And my final question, Chair, if I may. You delivered against your revised budget with regards to digital policing and actually had a £3 million overspend, but that was still £8 million under the original budget and follows an underspend on digital policing in 21-22. The Commissioner has been very clear that he wants to become a more data-driven organisation. How would you assess your progress to date on digital policing, and what do you think needs to be done?
I mean, I can only talk about this from a financial perspective on the digital. We're certainly in budgetary terms. You're right. There's I think about 8 million underspend on the original budget, but also that's in terms of our planning and where we've been sort of previously. That's an improved position. We are doing, Commissioner, one of the first things Commissioner said wanted us to do was the rollout of the mobile phones, which we've done, and we've done at speed. So we are dealing with that. But I think in terms of the overall digital ambition, I think the Commissioner would want us to be doing more, certainly in the overall digital space, but it's not something I can comment on in huge amounts of detail, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Ms. Humayun, you said something that I found really quite shocking this morning about some of the digital equipment that we have relating back to the 70s and 80s. Would you like to comment on this as well?
Yes, so I was talking about on the transformation side, the two largest programmes which were cited in the HMIC Engage report as being essential for the Met to come out of Engage is making progress on those two programmes. The legacy systems are dated. You know, in terms of Connect, there are a number of underpinning systems that are still in use that Connect will replace, and some of them are old. They're decades old. So I think progressing with both of those programs is essential, and it will make an impact to frontline officers in terms of just the ease of them being able to do their jobs. And I agree with you that the Commission has got an extremely ambitious digital and tech-based vision for the future. I think it almost goes back to an earlier question, though, around at the moment there is a capacity issue in being able to spend, and if you look at the ambitiousness of the current capital programme, it's not particularly ambitious in terms of it's fixing. I think it's fixing the basics in most instances. So I think there needs to be, and there is, a parallel stream of work in terms of bringing the technology, modernising the technology, making the job of frontline officers as easy and accessible as possible so they have the right tools at their disposal, but also exploring a bit more innovation. So, for example, the use of AI and to what extent that could be deployed by the Met and how it could lead to efficiency, for example, or better outcomes. And that's a piece of work that the Met is looking to explore. But I think they're very keen to just get on and deliver the capital programme as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember Ahmad. I had a question from Assemblymember Russell to finish off this section.
Yes, just very briefly, all this slippage and delay in terms of investment in the sort of basic technology, do you think that that we heard, I think it was a couple of weekends ago, the Met Police Twitter account tweeted out that 999 calls were not working. Was that related to this these technological delays?
That was a national issue. That wasn't a Met-specific issue, so it wasn't linked to these delays.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Assemblymember Russell. We now move on to the next section, which is MOPAC revenue expenditure. We have Assemblymember Duval.
Okay, we're going to concentrate on police recruitment and training. So the first question that I want to put to you is, what will be the impact of not achieving the recruitment targets in 2023/24, and will the Met still be funded to the full level of additional police officers? There's something about the Home Office issues there. So who wants to take that question?
So for last year, and then to go on to this year, for last year for police officer recruitment, we did, as you know, we didn't hit the target and we didn't receive the Home Office grant, which was about 31 million. For this year, the way the POP grant works is most of it is just rolled into main grant, but there is a small amount that the Home Office ring fence effectively as an incentive for recruitment. Last year it's 31 million. This year it's 61 million, and our current plans is that we won't achieve our target, and therefore we won't receive any of that income this year.
Okay, and is that, where does the flexibility come? Is it, if it's clawed back? Clearly, if you can't meet your recruitment targets, but you could spend that resource on other human resources issues that tackle crime. Is that something that the MPS has explored, or MOPAC have explored with the Home Office, of saying, don't take this money away, we can spend this and still reduce crime or tackle crime on other resources, or doesn't it work like that?
We have approached the Home Office and are continuing in dialogue with them around some of the recruitment challenges that the Met is facing. and how they could support it, because obviously there are various funding parameters, including police officer pay, that we just don't have the flexibility to set an autonomous route on. That said, the PUP programme was quite clear in terms of its terms, and it was specifically for officer uplift. So the Home Office's argument back to us is that as far as PUP grant goes, if we don't meet the terms and the targets of growth, we lose out on that funding.
So what are the causes of you not hitting these targets then, and the lack of recruitment around that? Is it the testing account? Is it the process, or what? No one's coming forward? What's your analysis?
I mean, there's a number of things, but we've got basically we've got a fairly buoyant market, so we've got applications down. We've got increased vetting timescales. We've got increased vetting failures as well, and some increase in deferring start dates from candidates. There's a number of things that are in play that's causing the challenge with recruitment.
And that must be a real worry to both MOPAC and yourselves. So what's the plan? Or do we just allow that to continue? Is there what activities are we doing differently than maybe you've done in the past then?
You'll be aware from the budget for 23-24 that the Mayor's invested approximately £30 million for an additional 500 PCSOs. That sits alongside the Commissioner's own target to increase PCSOs even further. That's part of his Met Reform plan. So I think part of the answer is looking at the whole kind of workforce and at what level of entry recruitment is likely to be more successful. That's one thing that's underway. I think we are continuing our conversations with the Home Office in terms of what flexibility there could be around pay. There's some internal work underway around the use of trained individuals in different posts. So it's not unusual for someone who's been skilled in frontline policing to perhaps temporarily explore a role in a non-frontline role. But the extent to which that's done is something that the Met are looking into, and whether actually there's any capacity to move such individuals from non-frontline into frontline posts. So a number of streams of work are underway, but I think the way you started your question is fair, that it is an area of concern, and it's something that is on the Commissioner's mind and on the Deputy Mayor's mind.
Well, let's drill back about pay then. So what's the evidence that you're saying, presumably we've been contacting people that have made initial inquiries to join the police and then pulled back? I presume we capture evidence around that pay is a determinant factor of why people are not wishing to apply and recruit. Where are we on that? What's the evidence?
We're just saying that I'm afraid we don't know the answer to that. We know that the Met's workforce and HR team obtain that information both from individuals who express an interest in joining and then may express concerns, but also individuals who leave the Met, so start on the journey.
So more about retention rather than recruitment.
I think it's a combination, but I'm afraid I can't tell you what those reasons are, but I'm sure that colleagues in the Met could. So if we could get back to you on that. But I know that there is an intelligence gathering at different stages of the process. So whether that's individuals who don't proceed with an application because of concerns, and that they could be about pay, they could be about other issues. And also individuals that then withdraw from the process. So once they've been offered a role, they could be under training, for example. They could be about to start on their frontline activity. They could have started on their frontline activity, but they choose to leave as part of the exit interview. We're gathering details on the reasons for exit. But I think we need to defer to our HR colleagues to provide us with some of the evidence that's coming back from.
Well, I think we'd be grateful for that information, both this committee as well as PCC. Chair, if we could make a note of that and follow that up.
I'll be happy to do that and to check with PCC as well. Sorry, the Police and Crime Committee. I'm acronym phobic. To see whether they also have been looking in this. I imagine they may have.
So in terms of the recruitment process, we haven't got any problems around capacity to recruit or accommodate these numbers. These are genuinely just a slowdown for whatever reasons in recruitment and people coming forward. It's not because we haven't got the capacity to deal with these numbers or the accommodation to place them in once recruited.
The short answer to that is no. So if you look at the recruitment we have done over the last, up until for the first 2 years, we were being successful with the recruitment, and we've built the estate with flex to get us up to these numbers. So it's nothing. It is just a slowdown rather than it being anything to do with our ability to bring the people in.
Okay. And just in terms of just going back over some of the issues, the plan to adapt to this new environment, because virtually there were people hammering on the door to come in, and it seems to have dropped remarkably. I mean, we may all have different views of why that's the case, but it doesn't come across that there is some alternative thinking. More of the same is what's coming across from both MOPAC and the MPS in terms of dealing with this problem. It is a problem, isn't it? I am right in thinking it's a problem, or is this not a problem for the organisation?
It is a problem, and obviously we want to get the number. We've got we have the budget, and we want to get the people in. Of course we do. So yes, it is a problem, and there are people who are working on this, obviously, really, really hard to look at the various options and look at what we can do to arrest this. I think what Amana and I are saying is we need someone else to come back to you and give you a little bit more detail on exactly what is being done.
Okay, all right. Just in terms of going back to capacity issues, so there's no concerns about the Met's ability to train new recruited officers. You've still got the teams in place. You're not dropping those teams, not cutting back on the capacity. You've still got those teams in place that was dealing with maybe better times of recruitment. Is that correct?
There are no capacity issues that I, on behalf of MOPAC, am aware of on the training front, no.
Okay. Chair, we need to come back to this. Both us and Police and Crime Committee, it seems to me, are around those resources. Can you also provide us with further evidence of your lobbying to the Home Office about that flexibility so we understand it? From this particular committee, we'd like to understand the value for money. So if you came off this programme, why would it provide value for money to spend on other issues without affecting the Met's ability to recruit additional police officers? So that would be quite important for us. And there may well be, if we could double up with the Secretariat to ask our police and crime colleagues if there were some other additional questions, it might save you later on this topic, because no doubt they'll be asking questions as well.
Yes. Yes, very happy to do that. And actually, the contextual question that I think is interesting is how what's going on in London compares with what's going on elsewhere. So my understanding is that it is more of a problem here than elsewhere, but again, that's probably straying a bit beyond our remit. But going back to my earlier question about how you should benchmark yourself against what other people are doing to in capital projects, and probably with this. Next question I have is Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. So my question is about overtime. Your report recognizes that the reliance on overtime, which I understand was around a £42 million overspend, the reliance on overtime to address the shortfall in officer numbers is not sustainable in the medium term. How are you planning to address this in the coming year? And what difference should we expect to see in this context in next year's outturn figures?
So yes, we've got, there's a number of things there. So yes, we've got an overspend on overtime last year. Worth just being cited on the split between what we would call our internally funded and those areas that get external funding, so like specialist operations that get specific counter-terrorism and protective security grant funding. So of our overspend, about 15 million is on the internally funded areas, and about 11 million is on those areas that get specific funding. It's something that we've done a bit of a deep dive into this in a couple of areas, because it is a cause of concern, because we habitually overspend on overtime. And yeah, a lot of what we're finding at the sort of top level is that we've just, because of the vacancies, we're incurring overtime to cover vacancies, which does lead to the question about just the overall size of the overtime budget, which we haven't got an answer to, but something that we are looking at this year as we go into budget setting next year. But there are also there's a couple of areas rather where we've got an operating model that's sort of predicated on overtime, and there's some work to going in to look at that as well, about whether that is the right model that we've got to fund those units. And then other ways, we've done quite a good look across all of our sort of BCUs about the controls in place, and we get quite a spread of overtime overspends in the different areas. We've identified some really good practice in some places, and some areas where we could be a bit more sharing and a bit of learning of that practice to improve some of the controls around overtime. So it's an area that we are looking at quite a lot this year, and I would hope for when you next see the budget and the budget proposals, we'll have done both a bit of sort of what we call sort of right sizing of the budget, and also be really confident about all the controls that we've got in place, so we've got some best practice, and we're driving down the spend.
Before I come to you, Amana, if you've got an observation, Ian, can I ask you, so can you give us some examples of some of these best practices? Because I think some months ago, when we last looked at this issue, one of my colleagues did ask who authorizes it overtime, how is it monitored, value for money, and so on. So I think some examples of good practice.
Yeah, I can come back, if you don't mind. I will come back to you on some of the specific. It is about having the right people doing really sort of some forensic control, and yeah, but that's that whole sort of authorisation piece. But rather than me give you half an answer now, can I come back on that?
Of course. I mean, you may not know the answer to this, but because this is something that has concerned us as a committee, so this all the time that I'll be on this committee. So presumably the decision to authorize overtime at the BCU level is taken by the chief superintendent, by the Borough Commander?
I'm not close to the actual
I'm just trying to understand the dynamics between operational
so.
practices, sort of financial controls, and so on. And we get whatever. Yeah. Amana, have you got any observations?
Just that we've been raising similar challenges to the Met around year on year. We see an underspend on pay, and then normally an equivalent overspend on overtime. It doesn't quite net off in the figures that you've got for 22-23, but it's not unrelated to the conversation that we've just had about not having the required number of officers. And I think Ian's absolutely right to make the distinction between the internally and externally funded, because of course where we attract external funding for officers, we would want to make sure we fulfil that, otherwise we lose income. But that may result in overtime to make sure we deliver the service and then also attract the income as well. So we've seen the output of this analysis that Ian refers to. So there has been a fairly forensic review internally, which hasn't taken place previously since I've been CFO anyway. And I think it's absolutely right to get down to the sort of BCU level. And I think it's just, we are going to have to wait to see how that analysis is going to impact the budget development for next year.
Okay. Well, I welcome the review, and presumably you'll share the findings with us at some stage.
Don't see why not. Yeah, we will. Okay.
So a couple of questions in the context of the national and international capital cities grant. So Operation London Bridge, which I think you spent £64 million on it. So did this £64 million, did the £64 million you received for Operation London Bridge cover all of your costs? Sorry?
I'm sorry. Yes, it covered all of our the additional costs that we incurred on Operation London Bridge. Yes.
Right. Sorry, additional costs. So
the way
I just want to make sure I understand this.
No. We produce a set of costs, and we work closely with the Home Office. But of course, some of our costs are what we call opportunity costs, because the police officers are working on them when we're already paying our salary. Yeah. But where those officers are working overtime, when we're hiring vehicles, accommodation, or whatever, all of those additional costs were in a bid to the Home Office, and they were all refunded.
Fine. So again, similar question about the policing of the coronation. Have you submitted a similar claim for the cost of policing the coronation? Or will you be submitting one?
That would be obviously this year, but I'd need to go and check as to what we've done on that this year.
Okay. So just to put on record, and correct me if my figures are right or wrong, because this is something I think many of us, certainly before my time even here, were asking questions about how the Home Office underfunds London. So the figures I have, and figures that I've had for the last 4 or 5 years, the Home Office gives us £185 million in terms of the National International Capital Cities grant. It's possibly that takes over and above sort of its London-wide duties. The independent panel assessor, this was back in 2015/16, accept, said that we should be getting 281 million. So presumably that figure is a bit higher now, inflation, all that. And the Met estimate, it needs around £346 million. Are those figures sort of fairly sort of accurate? Particularly £346 million.
Yeah, I'm doing this from memory, but those figures sound, certainly the grant figure is right. The total that we put in 2015-16 was about 350 million, and what the independent panel did was pretty much support all of the direct costs that we had identified. What they didn't cover was the overheads. So the panel effectively said, yes, we agree with what you've put forward as your direct costs for National International Capital City, but we can't afford to pay it all, so you get a grant of 180 million to cover those costs. Yeah. And yes, costs, we've not done, if you recall, when we did the costs in 2015-16, it was a very labour-intensive, a big exercise that we did to look across the whole of the Met. We've not repeated that, but we do some sort of high-level estimates, and we're in the middle of doing something at the moment. But yeah, the costs have gone up as well, as you would expect. Just simply by inflation, costs have gone up.
I mean, I know that this committee is concerned about this underfunding across party, and we continue to campaign and lobby for the Met to be fairly funded, and presumably the Commissioner shares our concerns. Well, I know the previous Commissioner did make her feelings very clear, and I think the present Commissioner has also given his thoughts, but the Met is continuing to lobby and campaign. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember Desai. So I now have one final question in this section from Assemblymember Fortune, who will then also take us on to the third and final subsection of this section, which is on reserves.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to start by finishing off on revenue expenditure, and this is for my own understanding, just because there's some more work I want to do on this. Where you break down the difference between police officer pay and police staff pay, because I've just looked at it top line so far. Police officer pay would include whom? Is that trainees and all warranted officers? All warranted officers, including anybody.
Oh, sorry, your point.
Sorry. Anybody who is a police officer or trained to be a police officer, their costs are in the police pay.
Right, okay. And then police staff pay, will that include all agency costs, cleaners, all that sort of cost as well?
It will include, yeah, so all people like me, agency and everything excluding PCSOs, right, which have their own line. So we have a separate line for PCSO pay.
And that's under the police off.
I think
separate. All right. Okay.
Do you summarise it differently?
PCSO pay. PCSO
Yeah, it just has a separate line on page 45 of the performance report.
Okay, because I was looking at some of the variances. Fabulous. I'll go away and do some more work on that. Thank you. Right, let's get to you not spending money. So we're on the section now about reserves in a kind of there is a Groundhog Day element to this as well, isn't there? So current reserves at end of March 2023 were 495 million. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. And what we're looking at is a plan to spend essentially the best part of 300 million, rounding up to 300 million over the next 2 years. Is that right?
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, I think it might be slightly less than that.
So so you can see where I'm going with this, because I've seen that sort of the quantum of or the level of reserves has risen year on year on year. The last 3 years I've had this meeting, there's been promises for that reserves to fall off, and it hasn't. So I'm just going to go through some of the lines. So can you give me a sort of top line review of what the plans are for that 300 million over the next 2 years?
Yes. So you're right, and we did have this conversation. I appreciate that last year. Context, though. So we've had PUP grant, we've had growth for the last 3 years. So we have been growing, and therefore our budgets have been going up. The money we get is not all for police officers, so we've got a plan around recruitment for police officers, but there's also money that we get for staff, for kit, etc., etc. So we have seen some growth, which has enabled us to put some money away into reserves while we effectively catch up, because recruiting staff, for example, can take quite a long time. I think it's important that, if I may, this year we have drawn down significantly on reserves this year. This time last year, we were having the conversation because we'd actually had quite a big swing, and we'd said we were going to use reserves, and we hadn't. We'd actually ended up putting money into reserves. But when we had our Q3 position, for example, we were forecasting a net 100 million of transfers from reserves, which was made up of 108 million we were going to draw down and about 7 million we were going to put in. When we got to the outturn, we did actually draw down 106 million. So we did what we said we were going to do in terms of the drawdown. What we ended up doing was putting 26 million back into reserves, largely due to some delays in projects. So in the same way we had some delay in capital, we had some project delays. We did have some additional income and grants as well, which we put into reserves because we just, we want to be prudent. We don't just want to spend money when we get it. And we had some underspends on PUP because of the delays in recruitment. So I would just say, just to give you a bit of context and hopefully a bit of reassurance, it's the plan last year is a different position to the year before. Now, going forward, again at the top line, we have a MOPAC have been involved and quite insistent upon this, and we've done a lot of work to scrub through the reserves. We've done a number of line-by-line reviews. We have taken out money, we've repurposed, or whatever word we want to use. We have used some money just to balance the budget this year. We are doing, well, our proposals, obviously, we're still working through for the budget for next year, but we're also planning on using some further reserves to help us balance the position whilst we put in place an efficiency programme. And you will see again a further drawdown of reserves. I think our latest plan is to use about 150 million this year of reserves, and then the year after, if you just bear with me one second.
I've got 194 million and then 97 million. That's the figures I've got.
It's in that. We're doing. We constantly review it.
300 million.
It's in that area. And a lot of this is now, because we've got more certainty. It all links back. But if you think about, Connect and Command and Control, I've mentioned a couple of times, we have got some money, because of the slippage, we've got some money in reserve set aside for those projects. And as we're coming into delivery, we will be drawing that down. There's also chunks for the business rates reserve that the Mayor gave us. So there's 30 million that will be drawn down. And just because whilst we've got the new commissioner in place, whilst we're reassessing some of our plans, we're just using the reserves to help sort of tide us over before we can then put in a sort of fuller efficiency programme.
Okay, and I do appreciate, I mean, looking at, I think when we had the meeting last year, we were on about 570 in terms of what was in the reserve. And so I think there's about 75 been drawn down this year. And look, what I want to do is understand it, right? Because I'm a fan if you're holding reserves that are sensible. And what I wouldn't want to do is to pressure you into just spending it to get rid of it, because that's not what we're after. So I want to understand some of these particular or specific lines. So if we look at operational costs, that's moved very little. It moved about 3 million from 22-23 down to about 105 million, from 108 to about 105. What's that for, and how do you sort of set the value that you want to hold in reserve? Well, what's that operating cost reserve, what's it for?
So there's probably about 50 separate lines within that. So at sort of headline level, some of the big numbers in there, there's a Connect. Connect reserve is about 17 million. We've got about 5 million for command and control. We've got some assorted projects that take operational projects in frontline policing. That's about 7 million. There's a major IT reserve, which is from a Pegasus project, which is about 30 million. Right. But we will be using some of that to help us sort of balance the budget. So there's a whole list of projects. Those are the sort of big picture numbers, but there's a lot more detail behind that, a lot smaller reserves. And there will be to answer the second part of your question, there will be a whole host of reasons that we set the levels that they're set at. So it will depend on, there might be business case for specific projects, there might be small underspends in certain areas that we wanted to put money aside for, a local operational initiative. There'll be a range of things as to how the reserves have been set.
So if you think about the 100 and so it's gone from 108 million to 105 million. Actually, if there's 50 lines below it, and only 3 million has been drawn down, that would suggest that there's potentially 50 projects that aren't working as fast as they should be. Where would that be, Mon? Is that something that MOPAC pick up? Would you go down to that sort of granular level, Amana, to have a look at it?
Yes, we do. I think this is a challenging position to look at. So, as you've said, if you look year on year up until 22-23, the position was always a net transfer into reserves. And at a time when we are trying to lobby the government for more money, at the time that we have a currently unfunded large transformation programme, you see these figures and it's quite easy to question, actually, well, here's a pot of resources. But we've talked about some of the areas of delivery that are fundamental to the Met, but there is slippage, and that money is being held here. So the money will be spent, it's just a matter of time. There are other areas where either the Met themselves have identified repurposing opportunities, or MOPAC have actually challenged the Met to say, are you really going to spend this money, particularly where the same funding has been carried forward for more than 12 months? And actually, in terms of thinking about how we're going to fund this ambitious reform programme, this is one of the first areas of opportunity. Ian's talked about historic, what we call scrubs of these numbers to identify. And when I say identify, even if it's a case of hundreds of thousands, that's the kind of granular level we're looking at. Yeah. Hundreds of thousands of pounds that could be extracted from these numbers to fund reform. And we've already got a set of proposals from the Met on where some of these reserves could validly be reduced if, for example, the initial intention for the reserve just no longer applies or is no longer a priority. Yeah. The scheme of delegation requires that the Deputy Mayor approves every change in the use of reserves, and we already have a set with us for approval.
Right, so the Deputy Mayor approves every change in the set of reserves?
I think that's required by the scheme of delegation. I don't know if it's subject to a de minimis of 500k.
It is subject to de minimis, but for completeness, we just put everything into governance. Yeah.
So that's quite interesting in terms of budget control. I think when I've run budgets myself. I'll do a Q1, I'll do a reforecast, I'll do a reforecast, I'll do a reforecast. I get to the end of the year, if I haven't hit the core deliverables and I'm still holding that budget, never in my career have I been able to roll that budget over. So how tightly is that managed in terms of those carryovers of budget, which is what is building this reserve? Because you're right, you look at the big number and it looks like one thing isn't moving, but actually as you get down into it, there are lots of things that are not moving, and that's a concern. So that was a garbled question. So can you tell us a little bit about the rigour around the forecasting, the reforecasting, and holding budget holders to account?
I mean, simply at the moment, it is quite painfully a line by line go through of all of these down, and they range from, the 30 million a year business rates to a couple of 100,000, and it's basically just a run through and a sort of not quite a use it or lose it, but not far off that. If we haven't got a plan to use these reserves over the time frame, then we've effectively taken them and are using them for other purposes. So that's what we are doing, and it's a constant. It's a constant review.
Because if we take another line, which is managing the budget, 22-23, that opened at 103 million and closed at 66. So what's that been used for? That's that's a 37 million drawdown year on year. What was that for? Got your microphone again, Ian. Sorry, mate.
Sorry. Part of that is an underspend generated from previous years, which the proposal is that we are going to use either this year. Sorry, if you just bear with me, I'm looking at two separate tables. So yes, we're planning to use. There's about 30 million of that will be used this year as part of balancing the budget. There's another part of that which is linked to a council tax deficit reserve, which is something we set up. I'd have to double check, but it was set up around COVID. So there's a plan for using that over 3 years, and the other part is. I think the initial plan was that was a net sum of money that we were using to contribute to the capital programme. But we are taking a view on that now, given our financial position going forward, and we might propose to repurpose that for use to balance the budget.
Okay, so you're talking about 30 million potential to balance the budget?
There's the 66 million end figure is made up of an underspend from previous years of about 30 million, about 30 on this. What I think, but I will have to double check, is the contribution to capital, and then about 7 million for the council tax deficit reserve.
Okay, that's quite interesting. I mean, look, all budget holders have, we've all held money in a drawer, haven't we? But this isn't a drawer within a drawer, is it?
No. What I really want to just give some assurance over is this is such a focus for us, not just with MOPAC, but internally, because of the challenges, as Amana said, about it does, on the face of it, look like we've got a huge sum of money that we're not using. But this is not a drawer of 400 or 500 million pounds in cash that we're sitting on at home. We genuinely have plans, and we are most definitely going to be using this, certainly this year. We did last year, this year, and next year.
So when this comes back next year, what will we see different around, some of that reporting as well? How will we know that what we talked about with the operational costs, what we've talked about with the managing the budget, how will we know that that's moved forward, other than just the number dropping?
My answer was going to be to see the number. You'll see the number dropping, and I think you'll have the assurance from us that we'll have done the work. You'll also have had the oversight and scrutiny from MOPAC to ensure that we do what we say we're going to do.
Because I always sort of stress that this committee is the budget and performance committee. And sometimes we rely too much on the budget bit and just the finance, but it's what's the money being used for. So where's the performance? So it would be good to have some more of that next year as well. The property reserve, what's that going to be used for, and when will it be utilised? That's 66.9, best part of 70 million opening in 22-23, closed on best part of 62 million. So what's that going to be used for? Sorry, Ian. It's like a live equivalent of you're off mute.
We've been using Teams the last 3.5 years. You think we get used to pressing the button now. So on that 60, so the opening balance. So that's two main areas. One of it, there's about 54 million of that is earmarked for ESB and the works on ESB.
Help us out with ESB for those watching at home.
Sorry, Emperor State Building and the counter-terrorism hub that's been put in place there. And the other balance of about 12 million is dilapidations.
Okay.
And that is most definitely something that we're looking at, because that is one of the areas where we don't actually have a plan to use much of that money over the next 5 years. Clearly, it's linked to exiting buildings and the timings associated with that, but that is one of the areas that's under focus now, because, as I say, it's one of the few areas where we don't have a plan to use in the short term.
Okay. All right, I'll speed up, Chair, if it's okay. I've just got one more, which is the MOPAC earmarked figure. So this is one that's gone up. So that started at 41.6 million, 22-23, and is now sitting at 48.9 million. So this is money, or reserve money, earmarked specifically for MOPAC. So what's that intended for, and why the increase?
MOPAC, it's not unusual for MOPAC and the VRU to receive additional grant monies in year. So in 22-23, we received in year, in flight, an extra 27.1 million, and that reflected about 25% of our gross expenditure. Examples include about 8 million, just under, for Operation Soteria from the Home Office, 10.1 million for the VRU to run, for the VRU from the MOJ, specifically for victims and female offending programs. So whilst it's fantastic to attract extra money, where we get new money for new services, there's a huge amount of work that needs to take place before we can just start spending the money. And until we spend the money, it needs to basically be held as captured in our budget. And if we haven't spent it all by the end of the year, it goes into reserves. So some of those grants that I've just explained to you are partly the reason why the MOPAC line has gone up.
Okay.
But just to give you an example, new money for new services would require actually identifying what the scope is for the funding. So actually what's the needs assessment that needs to be met. We then often have to consult with the market to identify what the sort of supplier network looks like and how we can commission the services. And then actually to go from designing the service to delivering can take months in following a proper procurement approach.
So just so I make sure I understand it properly, so if there is stuff that's essentially allocated to revenue spend for certain projects or certain deliverables, if that's not completed within a period, that underspend will move over to reserve to finish the project.
Correct.
How will that impact the revenue budget for the next year? Because presumably you're down capacity, right? If you haven't finished off what you were doing last year and you're going to do a similar thing next year, there'll be capacity strains, won't there?
No, not necessarily. Maybe I'm not explaining myself properly. So where we've received additional funding to run a new service, we may not necessarily be able to spend all of that money in the year in which we receive it. Also, it's not uncommon for our programs to run for more than one financial year.
Okay.
And so the amount of money that's not spent in year and is required to be spent in future years is placed into the earmarked reserve.
So it's not necessarily revenue funding, it could be one-off grant funding rather than money that's put into the budget to deliver.
It could be,
okay.
but it's all off a revenue nature. We don't get capital.
No, I see that, yeah. So I think what would be useful then is, could we see some sort of breakdowns for MOPAC and VRU spend then? So I don't think we've seen that. Maybe something that's gone to PCC, but staff, commissioning budgets, operating costs, things like that. I think that would be useful to get, Chair, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's not a problem. Yeah.
Very helpful, thanks.
very last thing. The one Met model, I think there's about 44 million there. Has that been utilised at all? I couldn't see. We had a look at the numbers, and I don't think that reserve has been touched all year, really.
3.7.
And that was supposed to be part of the implementation model, wasn't it, for the BCU rollout?
Yeah, sorry, I can't.
Sorry, you're on mute here.
You're on mute, Ian. Sorry.
That's all right.
I can't find that particular one. Can I, rather than me search through a whole list, can I get back to you on that?
That's great. Yeah, I've shot over time. Sorry, Chair.
Yep. I would appreciate that. Thank you very much, Ian. We now have a question from Assemblymember Harani.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the turnaround plan, which we're expecting any moment now, there's been a clear focus or clear indication that there'll be additional priority given to neighbourhood policing. So what do you anticipate the impact of that being on the property reserve and the estate strategy? Ian?
I mean, we're still. This is kind of half an answer because we're still working through that. So we've got in the new Met for London plan. Some of our initial estimates we will see a significant increase in estates costs based on the initial planning, but we're still working through that. So I can't give you any more particular detail around that, I'm afraid.
Okay, so no sneak previews of the impact on your budget for property.
Well, that would impact on the budget for property. Yes, it would involve an increase in our. It would involve an increase in some of our property costs, but of course we've got to find the funding associated with that as well.
Okay, so that will come later.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. I don't think we have any further questions on policing budgets or performance. So I'm going to draw this section of the meeting. Oh, sorry, was someone indicating? Sorry. So I'm going to draw this section of the meeting to a close. Thank you very much, Amana and Ian, for your answers this morning. We'll now have a short interlude while we change over guests for the second part of our meeting this morning, which will be about Transport for London.
Bang the gavel and then they'll start broadcasting.
Okay. Oh, hang on. Welcome back to the Budget and Performance Committee this morning. We are now in the second section with guests from Transport for London. So I would like to welcome Patrick Doig, who is the Chief Finance Officer for Transport for London, and Pritesh Patel, who is the Group Finance Director, also from Transport for London. Good morning, gentlemen. Our first group of questions to you this morning are from Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, and good morning to both of you. These questions are about operating cost increases, and in fact, specifically sort of other operating income. So other operating income was 1.585 million, it was 1.585 billion, wasn't it? Is that, or no, it was one.
Yes, billion.
That's million. Yeah.
It was 1.585 billion.
Yeah, thank you. Just written down oddly, against a budget of 1.474 billion for the full year. So that was 111 million higher than budget. And more than 400 million higher than the previous year. Now, I just wonder, sort of, can you explain the detail of that 111 million additional other operating income as compared to your revised budget?
Good morning. Yes, so the largest component of that variance, in the order of 90 million, was an accounting adjustment. So we have changed our accounting around the low emission zone income, so LES income. So prior to this year, we had offset income that is recognised when we issue penalty charges for non-compliant LES vehicles. We had offset that on the income line with the bad debt from those PCNs that went unpaid. And that's because with high levels of compliance and there is a higher proportion of low emission zone penalty charges that are not collected. But we have now separated that out, which we think is the right accounting treatment, provides more transparency on the underlying position, such that we recognise the full income in the income line, even if the income is not yet received. And then in the cost line, we have a corresponding increase in the bad debt expense as we write off any penalty charges that are unpaid. So that accounts for 90% of that £111 million variance.
Okay, and the other kind of 10% is that not collecting congestion charge and other charges, or is all of the bad debt to do with the LES, or is it LES and other charging income?
The bad debt adjustment, the accounting adjustment, was just low emission zone. That was £90 million. The rest of the variance is a positive variance where we have actually genuinely received more income than budget, but it'll be over the other road user charging schemes, the congestion charge, the ULEZ zone, but there's a long tail of other income sources, advertising, sponsorship, that flow into that line, so it'll be a small number of variances across those different lines.
Okay, that's really helpful. So are you satisfied that TfL has done all it can to try and reduce the bad debt on schemes like the LES, where foreign registered vans, coaches and HGVs may not only be dodging the charge but also polluting the air in London? And are there any figures on the impact of this beyond the financial bottom line, i.e. in terms of compliance with pollution reducing schemes?
So, simple answer is yes, and I think, again, if you stand back from it and look at the benefits, that's why this scheme's there in terms of the air quality benefits, and the compliance levels with this scheme. We track the compliance level regardless of whether the individual pays their charge or not. So our compliance levels reflect the true levels of compliance, therefore the true levels of air quality benefits. For the low emissions zone scheme that we're looking at in particular, the compliance levels are now very high. I'm just looking at the number. I think it's in the order of 98%. So, and when the tighter emission standards for the low emission zone were announced in 2017, they were less than 50%. So, an element of that would have happened naturally as people change their vehicles, but this has driven a faster level of compliance and therefore a higher level of air quality benefits than one otherwise would have received. I think that's a positive thing. That's demonstrating that the low emission zone scheme and our other emissions-based schemes are successful. I think to answer your question around are we doing enough to collect our bad debt, that there's a balance we need to strike. We need to make sure these schemes are robust, they achieve the air quality benefits they set out, but we also just need to be reasonable and measured about how we go about doing that. So we do have an escalation process. If you are unfortunate enough to receive a PCN, if you pay within the first 14 days, it's discounted to 50%, and after another period of time, it'll increase to a higher value. So there's a natural incentive and a chasing process to receive the income. Where we've been unable to receive it ourselves, we do work with enforcement agents that try and collect that debt with us, but we are very careful about the enforcement agents that we work with. We set very tight parameters for them to collect that debt, so we are doing it in a responsible way. And I think, therefore, we're striking the right balance. With foreign registered vehicles, it's particularly difficult. And even when we're a member of the European Union, it was reliant on bilateral country-to-country data sharing, which were sporadic and more difficult. So where we are able to collect data, we do work with enforcement agencies in other countries to collect that debt, but it is more difficult. And therefore, naturally, there'll be a higher level of bad debt for foreign registered vehicles.
Sorry, are you saying it's harder since leaving the EU because there is less? I mean, are you coordinating with agencies in Europe who may also need to chase foreign debt for tolls on roads or pollution schemes, potentially from British registered vehicles?
So no, so just to be clear, I was saying it's harder for foreign vehicles than versus domestic vehicles. I'm not actually aware that leaving the European Union has had an impact because, as I said, I think we've always been reliant on bilateral country-to-country sharing arrangements, and that's still the case.
Okay.
So it is hard, but where we are able to do so, we do so.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And can you explain why? So, in terms of the revised budget, which was approved in December 2022. Did this accounting change come in after that, or sort of why wasn't it expressed in the December 2022 budget?
So I think the simple answer is that it probably should have been, and it was an omission on my part that we didn't. I think the accounting policy we had for the low emission zone started in 2008 when the scheme was first introduced, but as the scheme has been tightened, and then that did increase the materiality of the transactions flowing through it, which then highlighted the necessity to make this accounting change. We have planned to make that change for next financial year. So the budget for next financial, the financial year we're now in, was set on this basis. But as we were closing the accounts for last year, we realised it was material enough that we should also reflect it in last year's accounts. So I think, with hindsight, I should have also processed it in last year's budget.
Thank you. That's all my questions, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Russell, I'm just looking around, I don't see any other indication. Oh, I do see an indication on that section. Assembly Member Fortune.
So just quickly from me, hello everyone. So the operating income was 1.5 billion against a budget of 1.47 billion. So which was higher than budget and more than 400 million higher than the previous year. And a lot of that seems to be down to the first full year of the low emission zones. Have we got a breakdown yet of the additional income from this low emission zone, including fines and payments, etc.?
I think that's what I was just
Is that what you're just asking?
about,
Okay.
yes.
Sorry, I was going through the notes. So, sorry, I missed it. When is that coming in? Sorry, I missed it. It's a genuine mistake.
Well, so we publish a quarterly fact sheet on the low emission zone schemes. I think if you would like something else, it's a very simple direct financial breakdown. That's something we could provide.
Okay. All right. Sorry, that's a mistake on my part. Apologies.
Okay, in that case, I don't see any more indications. So in that case, we'll move on to section on capital, which is Assembly Member Pigeon.
Yes, good morning. Let's look at the capital expenditure, which for the year in question was 1.9 billion and 133 million higher than budgeted. And the thing I want to really drill down into is this included the unbudgeted expenditure of 281 million on the purchase of the London Overground fleet of trains. Do you want to just talk us through when were the London Overground Class 378 train units purchased by TfL, and go and give us a talk through the process you went through, and then I've got other questions to drill into that, please.
Okay, I will start. I might ask Pritesh to add some more details. So these are the existing Class 378 rolling stock that we've had on London Overground for some time. It is the stock that runs through, in particular, the East London Line section, so through the tunnel. Therefore, it is a bespoke rolling stock. There's not other rolling stock that could operate on that section of the track, given the constraints that it operates. So we've had these since the mid-2010s, and they were originally procured through a leasing arrangement. And that was structured at the time because that was the most efficient and effective financing tool to purchase rolling stock. And at that time, the leasing arrangement meant that the debt associated with that lease was off balance sheet. So we didn't have to reflect debt associated with operating leases on our balance sheet. And we structured it such that the lease had a break point in 2027, although the expected life of the rolling stock is much longer. So we had a decision point in 2027 whether we would renew that lease and continue it for the rest of its expected operating life, or whether we did something different. But ahead of that decision, over the past 12 months, we've been looking at a number of factors to both reduce risk and cost. I think that's where Pritesh might be able to add some more detail.
Hi, morning. So some of those risks that we were looking at were interest rates. So interest rates are creeping up, and that was a risk as part of the leasing arrangement. There was a tax a risk as well. And thirdly, there was a refinancing risk in 2026 when that lease option became available. So those were the sort of three risks we were trying to head off when we were making this decision. And that's what led us to think about the different options that are available to us to sort of counteract that risk as it came ahead.
So I went through that process towards the back end of 2022. But actually we finalised that position in March, and that's when we executed the purchase of the rolling stock from the lessor. And the substance of the transaction was that it was a £280 million purchase that we financed through issuing debt directly. So rather than borrowing through a leasing arrangement, we have borrowed directly, and that debt sits on our balance sheet in full. But that combination of that risk mitigation of future changes that we couldn't predict, interest rates, tax, and the financing market, but also even on the current projections, this delivered a saving over the remaining life of the vehicles that was significant enough to warrant that transaction to be completed.
Okay, so just talk through, you said it was interest rates was a factor in this. Now, obviously, I understand the issue of interest rates at the moment, but the contract you had to lease until 2027, presumably that was that a fixed interest rate? No, so that was going up. So it's not that you were looking beyond 2027, you were in a position where every day virtually it's going up.
Yes, so it was a floating rate interest risk in the lease. That was the two elements. The interest rate risk was on the remainder of the lease to 2027. Yeah. That would increasingly go up if interest rates continue to go up. And then the refinancing risk would be that we'd have to strike a new deal, either a new lease or borrow money in 2027. And again, we wouldn't know the state of the interest rates at that moment in time, where we did have certainty on the interest rates in March 2023 when we executed the transaction, so it avoided those risks. Pritesh also mentioned the tax risk.
Yes, I was going to say, explain the tax risk point
So that's
to me,
relatively
please.
common in these types of long-term financial agreements, that if there are changes to taxation, the lessee, i.e. TfL in this case, would have to compensate the lessor if they're impacted. So if there was a change to a corporation tax or any other tax that impacted the lessor, it would be TfL's liability. So just trying to mitigate and hedge against these risks, removing the complicated leasing structure, have them directly owned by TfL with direct borrowing from government was the simplest and the most cost-effective way of managing that.
Okay, the tax risk, why are you looking at that now? Is that in anticipation there could be a change in government next year and things that are being said, or because that surely is always there?
Yes, so all these risks, interest rate, refinancing, tax risks are all there. I just think it was the state of the economic environment meant that those risks were all increasing. So it is not saying I've got a crystal ball and know what any of those things will look like in the next few years, apart from, I think it's pretty fair to say there's a level of risk and uncertainty which we could avoid by buying out the lease and removing our exposure to them.
And just explain in sort of lay terms the issue that originally with this lease the debt was off balance sheet, and now you've said you've borrowed directly, presumably Public Loans Board.
Yes.
And that's on balance sheet. Do you want to just explain that in lay terms, what that means?
Yes, so it's very much like an individual leasing a car. So originally, rather than paying for the purchase price of the trains outright, we paid an annual, quarterly actually, leasing charge I can't remember the exact number now, but an annual lease. So we didn't own them, but we were paying someone else an annual fee to basically use the trains. Prior to about 2019, 2020, that was just reflected as an annual expense. So in our accounts, all you would see is the annual leasing expense, which would be the payment we made to that lessor. So the equivalent of, again, an individual making that payment to their leasing company for their car. The accounting rules changed a few years ago and have forced us to recognise actually this is a debt that we have. This is a loan that effectively we've taken out to purchase these trains, and we are paying that loan back plus some interest. It's just structured in the form of a lease. So it makes it kind of provides more transparency, but it's meant that we had to recognise that actually we had a debt effectively to 2027 that we had to pay plus interest. So that brought a proportion of that debt on balance sheet, and in our quarterly reports you can see when we look at our debt, we have around about £13 billion of direct debt that we've taken out ourselves, and around about £2 billion worth of debt that's embedded in these leases. What this transaction has done is taken a proportion of that debt that was previously under leases and made it a direct debt. We've done that because the interest rate we can get borrowing through PWLB is lower than the interest rate we can get through a lease. So therefore it saves the overall public purse money.
But a lot of these issues would have been known around December 2022 when you reforecast your budget. So why wasn't it flagged then? Because it seems to me to come out quite late in the day that you've been working on this behind the scenes, and suddenly in March, end of year, quickly this deal has been done.
So these factors were changing during the pandemic, and I think I've said to you in the committee a number of times, one of the biggest challenges with the pandemic and also our funding arrangements has been a lack of long-term certainty. Therefore, our ability to plan long-term has been very limited. So only when we had the long-term funding deal last August did we start to be able to look a bit further ahead than the next 6 weeks or sometimes 6 days. So therefore we started to look at ways to hedge, particularly interest rate and inflation risk, that were the key risks that were emerging last autumn. At the time of finalising our budget and business plan in October, November, December, this was still an idea that we hadn't fully worked through. And it was only in January and February did we have the business case that we thought this was the right thing to do, and then in March that it was approved by the Finance Committee. So it just missed out by a couple of months, but that just reflects the fact that it's been very difficult to plan far enough ahead with the funding arrangements we've had. But some of the benefits of having a longer term deal is you can start to look ahead, anticipate these things, and do some of the decisions that are right in the long term.
But you said the Finance Committee made this decision in March. Was there any discussion before that, whether it's in the Part 2 sections of your TfL board meetings or whatever, for people to discuss this, to understand the issues that you were looking at, what you were trying to mitigate against before this sudden decision came forward to the Finance Committee? I'm trying to understand the scrutiny around this.
So certainly as part of the business plan, we had some general discussions about the increasing inflation and interest rate risks and a need to look at ways to mitigate them. And we would discuss that with board members as part of some of the business planning sessions we have. But also in the board meetings, I often get asked questions when presenting the finance about those issues, particularly interest rate risk. I think with return to the specific London Overground purchase, that was the only formal Finance Committee meeting we had. I believe we may have had a briefing session with the Finance Committee members ahead of that meeting. I'll have to check that offline and just confirm that in writing whether that did happen or not.
Yeah. I just think you just need to understand, suddenly people being presented with something like this, what the discussions were building up to that, and the input people would have had.
Yes, of course. I think although it is a complex transaction in some ways, it's actually a very straightforward business case. Stick with a lease, it's going to be more expensive and more uncertain, or buy it and avoid those things. So actually, once you've worked through the detail, I think the decision becomes quite straightforward.
Yeah, and you've explained it very simply to us today, which is helpful. Does the purchase change the responsibility for maintenance at all on the trains?
No, that sticks. The maintenance service agreement's unchanged.
Okay, and can you explain to me then, so you've decided to buy back these trains, but back in 2019, the Elizabeth Line trains, which you owned outright, and despite, the huge cost of the Elizabeth Line, the train's always separate. People forget that should be added to that total, the costs of building that new line. You sold it then and leased it back, and we were told this was standard industry practice at the time when I questioned it. Are you looking at the risk profile of that agreement now, given what you've explained today and, the huge rise in interest rates? And are you looking potentially in the next year to be making further decisions, maybe similar to what you've done on the overground trains?
Well, we continue to look at all our risk exposure and see whether we can either reduce risk or increase value. There are some differences between this rolling stock and the Elizabeth Line. Because of the East London Line tunnel, this is a bespoke train fleet, where the Elizabeth Line trains is more of a national rail specification. It's the same platform that runs on the rest of the London Overground, for example. So there is more of a secondary market, and there would be an alternative. We could replace those trains with other trains at some point. But with the Class 378s on the Overground, realistically, we had no choice but to keep these trains. The only other option would be to commission and build a brand new set of trains, which wouldn't have been the rational thing to do given we had trains that were operating well and still had life left in them. So there are some differences. So where there is a active market for trains, leasing is far more common, and I think I would describe it as industry standard. But where the rolling stock is bespoke, there is far less leasing. So, for example, all the London Underground trains we own directly because they are bespoke and unique. But to answer your broader question, yes. So we are looking at different ways of hedging risk. So, for example, the Elizabeth Line lease is one of the few remaining areas where we do have floating rate interest exposure.
Yes.
Now, there are a number of ways to mitigate that. Purchase them is one. Hedging that risk separately is another, or continuing to accept that risk is another. So we are looking through that, but we've got no plans to purchase those at the moment.
But that's being reviewed currently. to look at how to mitigate those risks?
Yes.
Okay, and the tax risk as well, particularly given what you said earlier.
I believe that will be present in that lease as well, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll watch this space on that. In terms of, if you hadn't bought back these train units at the end of the financial year, you would have underspent on your capital programme by about 128 million. Can you explain why there was such that gap, or were you always sort of earmarking this money, though not telling us you'd earmarked it for this particular project?
Well, to answer your last question, no, we weren't earmarking this money. I'm not telling you.
Okay.
But
That's good to know.
That was a factor in the decision making of that made this transaction easier to complete because we had an underspend elsewhere in the programme.
So what slipped in the programme? What hasn't been delivered, given we know there's so much need for investment across the transport network?
Yeah, so one element is our renewals programme. So we set a budget at the start of the year to spend 600 million. That was before we had the August funding settlement. That August funding settlement took us up to and asked us to spend and gave us funding to spend 635 million. Because that agreement came sort of August, almost 6 railway periods through the year, we weren't quite able to sort of ramp up that spend during the rest of the remaining element of the year. So we fell about 11 million short of that target spend. We've been talking to government about being able to roll that funding forward into this financial year to spend that money this year. And we're still waiting for them to decide on that. But we're quite pleased that we've actually did manage to spend more than the 600 million that was originally in our budget. And we spent, I think it was 624 million. So actually that's a really good achievement and sort of safeguarding some of those assets that are in sort of critical need for renewal.
Okay.
The last two elements of our capital expenditure underspend were on the Crossrail project. I talked to you before about resequencing some of the final elements of scope into this year, so that was a timing difference. And then on our housing subsidiary, TTLP, where some of our final projects again has slipped from last year into this year.
Okay, so that actually helped you hugely with this purchase. We've talked about the Elizabeth line rolling stock. Are there any other areas in TfL where some of these financial risks that we've talked about, interest rate rises, tax risks, whatever, are apparent and that you're looking into? Can you give us a bit more detail there?
We've been working through, and we had some other rolling stock that we had an element of interest risk exposure, and we hedged that separately over the course of last year. So we've been looking at a few different ways of doing it. The other thing we did last year is that we had a level of debt that was on a fixed rate, but with interest rates increasing, the value of that debt had fallen, i.e. people were willing to pay less for that debt, given it paying a fixed interest rate, and there were more attractive interest rates available on new debt. So in that instance, we completed a debt buyback. We bought back our own debt in the open market, and were able to pay less than the original value of that debt to buy it back. So we are able to reduce the overall value of our debt by, I think, £46 million by purchasing some of our debt back in the open market below face value. The final area that has some similarities but some differences, the largest area element of leased vehicles or rolling stock that's in our fleet is in buses. Because beyond the 1,000 new route masters, we do not own buses that operate in London. They are owned either directly by the bus operating companies, or they might lease them off a third party. We are looking at that at the moment. We've been speaking to bus operators and the bus manufacturers about whether that's still the optimal model. Less so from a interest rate and inflation environment, that is part of it. But given the significant investment we have to make in zero-emission buses, whether that's still the right model or whether there are any alternatives. That's still at relatively early stages.
So that's around the route masters that you own?
No, so that's around the 8,000 buses-ish that we don't own, whether that's still the right model.
I see what you mean, not the you know, I don't know, 1,000+ route masters that you own because there isn't a market to sell them on, which is why none of the companies would buy them in the first place. Is that right? Because there's no market outside London for them.
Yes. Again, where there were bespoke vehicles,
Yes.
leasing becomes uneconomic.
Okay, lovely. I think that answers my questions. A lot of we're learning a lot about accountancy sort of tricks and treatments here. It's quite an education on how you, I like that, you buy back your own debt and therefore you reduce your debt overall. I think that's quite extraordinary, but thank you for that.
Thank you, Assembly Member Pigeon. Before we move on, I would just like to take a moment to welcome pupils from the Year 4 of the Arc Globe Academy in Southwark, who are joining us in the public gallery for this, what turns out to be a very technical discussion. We're talking about how Transport for London buys its trains, and there's a lot of talk about debt and de-risking and not very much talk about trains, so I appreciate it might be tricky to follow. The next questions, though, are from Assembly Member Harani.
Thank you. Just a few follow-ups really on transport and the theme of the Elizabeth line regarding the purchasing of trains. So at the start of June, TfL confirmed that it was working on plans to procure more Elizabeth line trains to cope with demand when HS2 opens at Old Oak Common. How will these additional trains be funded, and what are you looking at, given the questions and the answers that we've had just previously in terms of the ownership arrangements or ownership stroke leasing arrangements in your future planning for this?
So thank you. You raise an important question. So we have announced, I believe, an indication of the need for more Elizabeth line rolling stock. We do not yet have plans to do so, as we do not yet have the funding to actually complete that transaction. But just step back to the context. So this has arisen because of the likely slippage and potential further slippage of Euston being the terminus for HS2 in London, and therefore the temporary terminus in Old Oak Common being the terminus for longer. Originally we thought they might be for a couple of years. I can't remember the latest dates. It might be in the order of 9 to 10 years. I think we're still waiting final clarity from government on the plans for Euston. So what we are concerned about is that the benefits of High Speed 2 will be eroded if people complete this wonderful journey on the new railway down to Old Oak Common, but then have a significant wait before boarding an Elizabeth line train at Old Oak Common. And some of our modelling suggested there could be a 10 or potentially a 15-minute wait to get on Elizabeth line train with the current capacity. So we think that would be bad for HS2 and bad for London and bad for the overall success of that scheme. So what we've highlighted is because of that government's decision to delay Euston, we think there's a need now to increase the frequency of trains that will run to Old Oak Common on the Elizabeth line to minimise that additional wait time and to assure as smooth as possible journey from HS2 into central London.
But if you need these additional trains, or if there's a need for more of the trains, you mentioned earlier in a response in relation to the overground that these trains are not bespoke. But I recognise that you've obviously had production lines in place to produce the Elizabeth line trains. Are these still in place? And is there still the risk of it costing more, even if you went to another producer? For the trains if you don't make that decision quickly?
That's exactly the issue, the reason that we are discussing something that's going to impact 2030 now. So the Elizabeth line trains were, I sometimes get my train manufacturers muddled up, built by Hitachi, and that platform that's also common on the, not Hitachi, I've got my trains muddled up, built by Alstom, in Derby. So those trains are on a similar platform than the London Overground trains as Class 710s. So that has been a very successful train platform, but we believe Alstom are bringing that generation to the end of its life in the not too distant future, and will move on to future generations of rolling stock. Therefore, if we're not able to place an order for these additional trains relatively soon, potentially by the end of this calendar year, we'll then have faced a position where that production line would have been demobilised and potentially some of the tooling would have been lost, which would make the subsequent purchase at a later date far more expensive. Okay. So if we do all agree that we will need more Elizabeth line trains, the moment to order them would be now, or at least in the next 6 months, so we can order them at the lowest possible cost, take advantage of the production facilities being ready to go. But clearly that's something that we would need government support for, as this is currently unfunded, and then we'll also have to work with the manufacturer, Alston, to make sure that that is possible.
Okay.
But at the moment, we're not able to do so, and at the moment we'll have to continue with the current planned service to Old Oak Common.
Okay, and Pritesh, is that something you're working on in terms of the figures for that, in terms of what the additional cost would be if we don't make that decision quicker?
Yeah, so that's something that we'll work through as part of our next sort of business plan process. So we're starting that process now, and through the summer and the autumn, we'll be including that as part of our business planning process.
Okay, and in relation to a previous answer on the London Overground Class 378 trains, it was mentioned, I think by you, Patrick, that there was a saving. What was that saving?
The saving of the net present value of the purchase was about £20 million.
Okay. That's good.
Thank you, Assemblymember Harani. And I have a final question to TfL, unless anyone launches in at the last minute, from Assemblymember Fortune.
Thank you very much. Apologies. You'd sent over the information Monday evening and I hadn't seen it. Sorry, so I've had a chance to look at that now. What I was digging into actually was the differences between the income that's come in from people paying to drive in the user charging zones, the ULEZ or the LEZ, and the fines, and the income that had come in from fines. Is that information in here? Can I find that? Because I haven't seen it. I've only just had a quick look over the email that was sent on Monday.
No, I believe the sheet we sent you was showing the gross income and then bad debt numbers.
Right, so can you split out the income that's come in through fines and the income that's come in through people paying to drive?
Yes.
Yeah, is that something you've got to hand, or could you send it to me?
It's something we can certainly share with you, and something that we've shared with the committee, I think, in previous times. So we can do that, yes.
That'd be really useful, because what I'm trying to do is sort of think to what happens potentially in the future. Looking at the risk register, I noticed that the ULEZ London-wide expansion is now rated at a 9. With considerable risk. It says uncertainties around the judicial review continue with decision imminent. What sort of mitigations have you started to get ready in case the judge doesn't find it the way that perhaps the mayor wants?
I'm not quite sure we're looking at the same risk register, but it is true that there's 2 elements of...
Do you want me to it says top risks and issues. There is a risk, ULEZ-wide exemption, the timeline for camera and signage installation, and the risk that some boroughs might present a delivery barrier. Uncertainties around judicial review continue with decision imminent, or whether High Court will grant the case permitted to proceed.
Okay. Well, as I said last time I was in the committee, our focus has been on twofold. Firstly, delivering the ultra-low emission zone and having it ready for go live at the end of August, and then provide the information that the court requested to demonstrate we took that decision lawfully. At the moment, the judge has indicated that they will provide their judgment, I think, by the end of this month. So we're waiting to hear that, and clearly we'll respond to it. But our focus remains on delivering the scheme and supporting Londoners with their transition, particularly through the scrappage scheme.
So has there been any sort of financial preparation or thinking, just in case the judge says that the scheme shouldn't go forward, or that it should be delayed? Because I know there are other issues as well. You know, there's the unlawful removal of cameras, etc. So there must be other mitigating factors coming into play soon, which will cost money.
So we've not completed any financial contingency planning for the scheme not proceeding.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Final then, we have a question from Assemblymember Pigeon.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the answers you gave me on the rolling stock. Obviously, you have this leasing arrangement, which seems to be normal in the industry. But why didn't you originally, when you were looking at purchasing these trains and rolling stock, just gone to the Public Service Works Board as you would normally, which presumably would give you a fixed, cheaper rate? What was the issue at the time? Why didn't you just use that originally?
Very good question. So until 2018, when we had capital funding settlements with government, they provided a level of funding, originally through grant and then through business rates. But as part of a condition of that funding, we had a constraint on the amount of borrowing TfL could complete. So therefore, we had to kind of optimise what that borrowing could be used for, and where there was ways of financing capital investment that did not score against that borrowing limit, they became more attractive. We're no longer in that position. We are clearly subject to the broader prudential borrowing code to make sure any borrowing we do is prudent, sustainable, affordable, but it's not set by a limit by the Treasury. Therefore, we have more flexibility to make the right value for money decisions when it comes to borrowing.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to get that clarity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Member Pigeon. And so I think that brings to an end the second section of the meeting looking at Transport for London. So thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Pritesh. We'll now have a short adjournment while our panel of guests switches around. So we'll be back in around 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Thanks, Pritesh. What time is that? 12. Do you have any peeled grapes as well, Paul? Perfectly aligned, all the corners straight with the other corners. Okay. Good. Let me turn my microphone on. Good afternoon and welcome back to the third and final part of our Budget and Performance Committee meeting for this morning, where we are joined by members of the GLA finance team. We have Enver, who's the interim Chief Finance Officer for the GLA. Good morning, Enver. We have Tim Steer, who's the Executive Director for Housing and Land at the GLA, and Andrew Williams, who is the Head of Housing for the South Area GLA. Good morning, gentlemen. We have a couple of sections of questions for you this morning, starting with Assembly Member Harani.
Thank you, Chair. So my first question is actually on a major area of overspend that's in the budget around the affordable housing programme. So what was the nature of the £323 million overspend on the affordable housing programme's capital budget? Tim.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll come in on this one. So I think I just want to start off by saying that the overspend, as it's called, shouldn't be seen as a bad thing. Yes, we did spend more money than we forecast to spend at the beginning of the year, but that was very much because housing delivery performance far exceeded expectations, the expectations that we had in a very difficult economic climate, and we went through some of the detail of that with the committee last time I was here about a month ago. The difference between the spend we made and the forecast was largely due to four things. It was that there were more housing starts than we expected over the year. We talked a lot last time about the lengths we went to with partners to try and maximise the number of starts that we were able to achieve working with them. And we were more successful than we expected to be. At the beginning we forecast around 17,800 starts on site, and by the end of the year, as we know, we delivered well over 25,000 starts with partners. We also took some steps to vary payment tranches, so providing more money to partners at start on site as a proportion of the overall grant that they were expecting, which was to help them out with their cash flow during a difficult time. In some cases, we did allocate additional grant to schemes. We were in discussion with partners about schemes which wouldn't otherwise have come forward without some additional grant because of the cost increases and other issues that partners were facing, and around 80 million was provided to partners in this way, and we very much we worked very hard to ensure value for money in those circumstances, and we can come on and talk about that if that's useful, how we did that. And we also supported some changes of tenure as well. Some partners in some cases were keen to switch to social rented products because of uncertainties around the future sales market for shared ownership. We were willing to help with that and support that because it's very much in line with our policy objectives and the need for social housing, but that has a cost to it too, and there's more grant required for those kinds of schemes. So we did make these changes to the programme over the year, which meant an overspend against the original forecast, but we did so very consciously. We did it in full discussion with the department and with the Mayor's team to respond to the risks that we saw around housing delivery, and to make sure that we were playing our full part in supporting the economy in a difficult time.
So when you talk about more starts, so is that just a more sheer volume of starts that you weren't expecting? How much of this is sort of starts being brought earlier, and then what is if it is the case, and what's the knock-on impact on the forthcoming figures? Does that mean that we'll have less starts and less spend?
Yeah, I mean, it very much is more starts than we were expecting during last year. As I say, the figures moved from about 17,800 to over 25,000.
So you're not expecting that to impact following or subsequent figures?
I mean, I think there will be. I think that in general, we talked last time about the hockey stick effect, the fact that there was a major deadline at the end of March 2023, the fact that the programme, the 21 to 26 programme that comes afterwards is more restricted. And so I think partners did work very hard to bring some schemes within the 16 to 23 programme, and I think that will contribute to a slower start on the 21 to 26 programme.
Okay, and is there any reason why this wasn't anticipated in quarter 3 22-23 in the forecast?
I mean, I think, yeah, the forecasting is very difficult, particularly in such a volatile economic climate. And I think we talked last time about this hockey stick effect. It really was Q4 where a lot of this came together. I think right up until the end of the year, really, we weren't expecting to meet that target in many ways. We thought there was a very high risk that we wouldn't. And it was that work in the final quarter, these changes which we made to the support we were offering to partners, which allowed us to get that number up. But it was very much in the final weeks of the programme where we were getting the very big delivery numbers.
Okay, you've already spoken about the starts on site being accelerated by engaging with your partners. Another thing which you haven't sort of mentioned is sort of programme flexibilities agreed with DLUC during February and March, which enabled projects to progress, and the expenditure achieved. Can you shed a bit more light on the work with DLUC?
Yeah, I mean, Andrew might want to say a bit more about this because Andrew was in a key role interfacing with DLUC in the final months of the programme. The key flexibility we agreed with DLUC was that we would be able to keep the grant funding which they were providing, even if we weren't able to hit the 25,000 homes target which we'd agreed with them. Now, in the event, we were able to hit the 25,000 homes target, but what that flexibility allowed us to do with confidence was to what we call safeguard schemes by where it was justified looking at additional grant, and we could do that in the confidence that if we then didn't hit the overall target but had still spent the funding, that we would be able to keep that funding. So that was really important, that flexibility that we'd agreed with DLUC at that time.
Okay, and what were the risks to the GLA of this approach?
Well, I think we were able to minimise risk to the GLA given the flexibilities we had agreed with DLUC. If we hadn't been able to agree that flexibility with DLUC, then there would have been some more risks sitting with the GLA. There might have been a situation, in theory, where we'd provided additional grant to some schemes, then also hit the target and found ourselves overspending against the budget. But I think we were able to mitigate that risk through the flexibilities which we agreed.
Just picking on something that you mentioned before about converting or allowing conversion of a change in scope in projects from shared ownership to social rent. Has that meant a reduction in numbers of homes started than would have been if there were more shared ownership options? So has it had an impact on anticipated figures, or is it simply the fact that you've ended up spending more grant monies as a result of it, and that hasn't impacted numbers but will impact budget?
I think for the 16 to 23 programme, it's the latter. It's we were really seeking to maximise the numbers of homes that we could achieve by supporting that social rented product, and that if we'd insisted that the partners stuck with shared ownership, then schemes may well have not come forward. I think looking forward into the 21 to 26 programme, where we have been working with government to try and increase the proportion of social rent, that does come with a trade-off there. The more social rent there is, and we think that's where the greatest need is, the lower the overall figures will be, because the grant required is so much higher for social rent. But we feel that's the right way. We and government feel that's the right way to go given the need that exists in London.
Okay, and some developers have been talking about the requirement on which haven't been implemented by national government, but GLA have written to developers about the staircases and having 2 staircases on high-rise buildings. Is there an anticipated impact on that in the figures?
Well, I suppose looking back into 16 to 23, that was certainly one of the issues which our partners were dealing with. There were some increased costs that resulted from the second staircase requirement and redesign of schemes. But looking forward, similarly, I mean, we're working with partners very closely on the impacts of this requirement. We, the Mayor, are very clear that this is the right thing to do, that fire safety is absolutely the primary priority here, but then working with the sector to understand the impacts of that and work our way through it and understand how that affects costs and viability is a really important part of our work at the moment.
Okay, that's it from me, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member Harani. I believe there's a question from Assembly Member Pigeon next.
Yeah, could I just pick up that there is an overspend on the Building Safety Fund of around £58 million. And, you know, the explanation I've got here is it's to do with the pipeline uncertainty related to cladding remedial works and inflationary pressures on construction costs. Can you explain this a bit more, perhaps in lay terms, of what it means? But also, is any of this programme eligible for funding through the government's Building Safety Fund? Because I thought we were almost administering a government fund, so I couldn't quite understand whether this was something slightly different, why we would be having a cost to the GLA.
Yeah, no, absolutely. These costs are covered by the Building Safety Fund. So the costs of our remediation work at the end of the year are all covered by the government funding provided to us, and so there's ultimately no cost to the GLA. There have been some differences to forecast on the building safety programmes. I think at the beginning of the year, I've got the figures here, we were forecasting 372 million, then during the year we revised that to 262 million, and then ultimately we spent 321 million, so somewhere in the middle. I think, you know, a bit like forecasting for the Affordable Homes Programme in volatile economic times, these are complex, difficult, unpredictable schemes, and they're very hard to forecast accurately. Clearly, we are focused on forecasting. We need to try and get those right, but our key focus is to try and drive those programmes forward, or those projects forward, as quickly as we possibly can. Just to say, I think one of the key reasons why the forecast differed so much this year was partly to do with the developer pledge policy coming from government. So quite a number of our schemes which have been in the funds which we're administering, as you say, are now coming out of those funds to be paid for by the developers. So there has been a downward effect on the amount we spend versus what we'd forecasted at the beginning of last year.
Okay, but just to absolutely clear, anything around the building safety stuff that we administer, we don't then have to put any extra GLA money in it. It's absolutely all covered by government. And if we wanted to do our own scheme in London, I'm not saying, but if we did, that would be our own money for, I don't know, buildings below a certain height we might want to. That would be separate to this.
Yeah, for the schemes we have at the moment, it's entirely covered by government funding.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member Pigeon. I now have Assembly Member Duval.
Can we go back to the overspend that wasn't an overspend? So the action that you took based on the final quarter in terms of some of the decision making that you had to do, how do we know that we've got value for money? I think you earlier suggested that we could. So what's the evidence around those different various projects that you're presented to in that final quarter that puts those numbers up, that we got value for money?
Yeah. And Andrew, this is where certainly Andrew should come in and talk through some of the detail on this, but because this is about the programme management processes that we use on this programme, and value for money is absolutely primary consideration for us. But negotiation with partners is absolutely vital, and we talked a bit last time about the relationships which the team have with the partners, and that gives them the ability to have effective negotiations. We're really trying to enable proper scrutiny of financial information by the team of what partners provide. So we ask them to provide a range of information, financial information demonstrating the cost gap on the projects. We're asking about the grant rates they say they need, the build cost, the scheme income, how much of their own resources they're using to keep the project going. And then we make significant use of benchmarks. So we're looking across the team at how what effective negotiations are looking like and where grant rates are ending up through those negotiations. So everybody knows what they're aiming for in these negotiations. And then bringing it together for a really formal peer review process, which Andrew coordinated at the end of the programme, and that I think gives some pretty heavy scrutiny on requests which are coming forward, and the teams need to set out how they've achieved what they believe to be the best deal for the GLA to protect the overall delivery. And then that goes through a process of senior sign-off through me or the Assistant Director for Housing to check that we think that there is that consistency across the teams. But it's probably worth Andrew coming in here. I may have stolen his thunder a little bit, but...
I was going to say to him, yes. But absolutely, as Tim set out, we put significant amounts of pressure on partners to deliver their targets, their commitments last year. And in return, we expect that level of pressure on our grants. So we're clearly managing the risk associated with that really carefully. I think Tim's outlined essentially the three key elements of the oversight we have, which is kind of our area teams, the delivery teams, Northwest, Northeast and South, of which I'm now head of, but I was at the time overseeing the programme as head of programme management. They work directly with partners to work at proposals. They're fully informed about our benchmarks, about what we consider value for money. And also they're negotiating with several partners on several projects at any one given time, so they're very well informed. As Tim said, that all comes together more formally when the teams, having gotten to a position they feel comfortable with, then present their proposals to Affordable Housing Programme Review, which is AHPR for short. And again, we've got experienced professionals there from each team, each area team, delivery team, called programme leads, and they're accompanied by senior members of the programme team as well. And that's essentially the scrutiny of that, again, for the similar kind of similar benchmarks, similar kind of looking at deliverability, looking at value for money, and of course strategic fit as well, with making sure that the homes are delivering what we want them to achieve. I think Tim's kind of highlighted the kind of key elements of the kind of benchmarks and the assumptions we'd consider as part of that group. I'm happy to talk more about some of the kind of individual stuff we did to assure the deliverability of the schemes that we were funding, and also to talk about the evidence. And as Tim said, the recommendations from that group would then be passed up to Tim or Heather as Assistant Director to make formal kind of approval. I think a really good, in terms of evidence, all proposals are uploaded through the GLA's investment management system, GLA Ops, which I'm sure you've heard of before. That is that's an extension of our funding contracts partners. What partners upload on that system in terms of the bill costs and other assumptions they are contractually obligated to make sure that's correct. The GLA will review those, but also the GLA will keep that under review. And partners, they update those costs that start on site, which is, the claims they were making in, Q3, Q4 last year. They'll also update that through the course of the programme and finally at completion as well. And obviously we will then look at the final costs associated with the project. If it turns out that costs are significantly lower and that we feel we may have overpaid, we'll review that and have the ability to claw back funding. Likewise, similarly, the GLA instigates a kind of regular audit process of schemes that have completed on an annual basis. And again, we're able to, that will pick up things like costs and other, ensuring that partners are doing have done what they said they did and are doing what they said they would do. And again, if partners are found to have failed or misled us in a certain way, the GLA then has the ability to take further steps, including reclaiming funding.
Now that period of time must have been an incredible experience, or adding to the experience of your team that was working on it, in terms of the pressure and the nature of the decisions. But going back, and it may be that you do need to expand. So you've got a core framework that you're measuring against, whether you're going to go change, accept variations and issues of that. But of course, we're always told as politicians that sites vary, and therefore subsidy varies in terms of that. And that must be the crucial element around the value for money of that. The other issue we're told is it's always commercially confidential, so it's hard to track the value for money. But you just told me that you're auditing the process. But on the variations, tell me, on compliance, in that period, was there a high compliance in those schemes that you signed off, or was there some failure? I can't think of another word. It's not failure, but in terms of that, which were the deals that didn't quite go through in the way that you wanted, or you uncovered there was a bit of skullduggery from the robber barons, whoever the robber barons is in this case? Because you're holding the ring here, aren't you? You're under pressure. You and DLUC are probably working together, because they also have a role in the sign-off process and that, isn't it? They give you the money, you've got to be accountable for it. So even in that period of time, you would be double checking with them that this is where we're going and we've got this opportunity to do it at some course, or doesn't it work like that?
Well, we work very closely with DLUC at a strategic level, but it is a devolved programme, so the decisions around which schemes to fund and whether to, for example, top up grant funding lie with us, but we do report regularly to DLUC on the overall progress of the scheme. I mean, in terms of the negotiation process, by no means was this a process where we simply signed everything off, where we waved everything through. And I think Andrew's got a couple of examples of schemes we didn't sign off, and I think that might help illustrate the kinds of scenarios where we were, where our negotiations were very much protecting value for money. So perhaps I'll just hand over to Andrew for that.
Thanks. I think it's also important to clarify there's two things here. There's the initial scrutiny of the three levels that I've talked about, and that gets us to a position where, from a scheme not being approved by the GLA to a scheme being approved and grant being allocated. In respect to the auditing that you've talked about there, that is then later down the line at scheme completion when we know what the final costs are. But in particular, yes, going back to the initial scrutiny of schemes when they first come into us, yes, the HPR process is not straightforward, and I've sat on that, both chairing it and also trying to bring schemes forward through. I know firsthand how hard it is to get stuff through there, get schemes through there. But yeah, absolutely, it was not it's not an easy ride, and the group really carefully balances kind of committing, obviously, to help unlocking delivery, with of course the GLA's commitment to ensuring value for money, and of course that we have enough money left over to deliver what we need to do in terms of targets. But absolutely, yeah, and the schemes. A couple of examples of why schemes either get deferred or rejected, or that would be potentially because the group came together and felt as a group that actually the grant rates being proposed for a single given scheme were too high, and that actually an area team could go back, an officer could go back and negotiate a lower rate to ensure value for money. So there was a 35 home scheme in North East London where that was very much the case. Other examples would be where just in the information, probably the grant rates probably felt about right to the group, but actually the information provided as justification just wasn't comprehensive enough, and again it gets sent back for further information so AHPR can make an informed decision. And of course ultimately schemes do get rejected if, for example, a partner refuses to budge on the amount of grant that they want to bring forward. We will give a formal rejection, we just not consider that scheme anymore. That leads to one of two things really. One, the scheme just does not come forward, and we've had a couple of those schemes now which partners just weren't able to bring forward at the time, we weren't able to fund, and we're looking to see what we can do in the new programme to potentially bring that forward. Or two, it's a message that the GLA, it's an important message the GLA is giving out to partners that we're protecting value for money, and partners will go away, perhaps get a revised board approval and come back to us at slightly lower grant rates. So I think that's probably some good examples of where HPRs, where our scrutiny has clearly not just waved things through, clearly, and at no point do we all get scrutinised, but clearly some examples there where we were either deferring or rejecting proposals to us.
This is going to become the norm, isn't it? Some of these opportunities that may arise even in a chaotic economic environment that we work within. Are you thinking and anticipating that this is going to be like this at different times? There may well be other opportunities that come forward. Because if the developer revises their costs or wants to come back and say to you, I can't make sense of the market at the moment and this may be the best option, you're always open to those approaches, aren't you? You wouldn't just wait, this is where we are. It just seemed to me at that particular time, bit of herd management, there were a number of them coming back to you saying, well, we can't make sense of this and we'd like to do this. So do you think there's going to be more of that? Is that something that we're going to see in terms of overspends in this area as opportunities that may arise that make sense for both you and DLUC in terms of provision of housing?
Yeah, I think it comes back to the general point that this stuff is very difficult to forecast. We need to be strategic in the way that we make decisions, and we prioritise the best investment opportunities, but we also need to be opportunistic, and we need to work with partners to try, if we can, in a way that works for value for money, to protect schemes in a very difficult environment. And we need to be open to considering anything which partners put forward, but we then also need to be rigorous in our decision making around what we ultimately do support.
Thank you for answering my questions in the way you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember Developers. Interesting questions there, actually, particularly about the difficulty and uncertainty. I think, I'm looking around, I can't see any more indications, so I think that's it for our questions on land and housing, which brings us to our final section, which is Assemblymember Russell, about GLA reserves.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. So the GLA holds reserves on behalf of the wider GLA group, but what we're talking about here is just the GLA specific reserves. And in the 2023-24 budget that was published in February this year, the GLA forecast for 2022-3 anticipated the reserves at 31st of March to be at 317 million. And in fact, the outturn shows that the year-end reserves were 467 million. So how do you account for that 150 million difference?
Good afternoon, committee. I'm struggling to get back to the 300 figure, Assembly Member. I recognise the end of year number.
What we've got, I've got a table in front of me here with the March 23 showing 316.7 million in the in the figures that we got for the 2023-24 budget, and the actual being 466.5.
I can't quite get back to those numbers, but
I wonder if Gino, are you able to help with that? I mean, I'm using the figures that we've got here.
Yes, so the figures that were published in the budget document this year are the figures we're using as the forecast for the March 2023 figure, the 316.7.
I can't get back to that. But
perhaps could you? Maybe we should take that question into written form.
What I'll do is I'll just explain a little bit more about the reserves overall. So I think first of all, we finished the year with actually 1.16 billion in the reserves, and those reserves, it's hard when you look at it to just say this is GLA and this is group. So I did a bit of analysis just to try and, because I anticipated that we'll have that discussion. What I would say is GLA ended on 463, just under 463 million, and then the rest I think are group related ones, so we can come back onto those. The balance in relation to that 463 the year before was 330, just under 340 million. So it has increased. So the general point is those GLA reserves have increased. The most significant one of the increases is the contribution in of the 90 million that was for the climate change in that year. And that money hasn't left in that financial year. So the money went in, so that added to the most significant part of the adding in.
Sorry, that was which exact?
That was the 90 million climate emergency funding money that we've discussed in previous.
Yeah.
So that went in with nothing coming out of it in that same financial year. So that added to those GLA reserves. One could question whether that actually is a GLA reserve or it's actually a group reserve, because its intention is to actually benefit the wider group.
Mm-hmm.
In its classification here, it's sort of above the line, but if I was redrawing it, I'd probably say that should probably be put together in the group, because it's not just accessible by the GLA, it's accessible by the wider group, and it's subject to that pipeline that we're now working on. So that's added to that amount. The other significant amounts are this revenue grant unapplied. So money comes in sometimes late in the year, it doesn't get spent for what it's intended for. Some of it's conditional, some of it's unconditional. the money gets put into the reserve and it's rolled over, and then as it's drawn down the following year, it goes back down again. So it fluctuates quite a bit, and that particular one, there was an 84 million drawdown, but there was 114 million addition. So 114 got added in at the beginning of the year, 84 got drawn down. So at the end of each year, that figure fluctuates. Maybe next year it'll be more coming out than has gone in. So that's a fluid particular reserve. The rest of them are earmarked.
Sorry, just to double check on that, that is money that comes in for specific purposes, but there may be reasons why it takes time for it to be spent, and hence it ends up in the reserve.
Exactly.
Just for clarity.
Sometimes it comes with certain conditions, sometimes it doesn't have conditions, but in order to mobilise whatever team it relates to actually get the money out of the door, it has to be put into reserves. And I think a bit like what MOPAC said this morning, rather than just hurrying to spend it on inappropriate things, it gets put into reserve until the right decisions have been made, the right governance has been made, and then it gets spent. Usually the following year, if not sometimes the year after. So that reserve will always be there as a sort of a fluctuating reserve. There's also a reprofiling reserve where certain directorates underspend. Historically, the nature was at the GLA that underspends just rolled forward into the following year. It went into the reserve, and then people got their money the following year. That's not very common elsewhere, and we have been tackling that. So that is used as the place to put the money at the end of the year, but it's not a guarantee that the directorate or the unit who underspent it will have that money back guaranteed. So it goes through an internal rigour with both the Mayor's Office and our corporate management team. We have finance challenge sessions to justify whether that money can go back to where it was intended in terms of what are the consequences of not having it, or otherwise it stays in reserves until new bids come in through the year for projects that are more purposeful, and they get allocated through the year. So there is a sort of general balance of around between 300 and 400 million on these reserves. I expect some of them to come down in coming years, and then there are what we would call certain types of reserves that I would say are more for sort of volatility, where you would never go below a certain level. And bearing in mind we sit at group level, those reserves are not just held to sort of help cover any risks for the GLA, they're there just in case of volatility across the group. So some are earmarked, some are carry forwards, some are sort of volatility type reserves. Okay, and the ones that you were expecting to come down kind of over this next period are, how did you characterise those? So the ones that are earmarked, I expect to come down because those projects need to happen. Some are happening at the right pace, some are not, and that we pick up through the performance framework. The carry forwards should come down, but then what happens is there's new carry forwards. The volatility ones I expect to stay at a certain level because we set them as a cushion to sort of safeguard against,
protect against risk.
risk.
Okay, thank you. That's all very clear. So I now want to pick up on the Mayor's £500 million fund, which is to support net zero by 2030, which was press released at the end of June, and it is funding that is available to organisations in the GLA group, but also the 32 local authorities, social housing providers, NHS bodies, universities and colleges. And organisations, I think, can bid for loans of $1 million to $75 million with flexible loan terms and lower interest rates than the Public Works Loan Board. Now, so this was, yes, announced in June, but we also, I think, found out at that point that it is not now funded by the Green Bond because the bond is not, and I think this is a quote, expected in the near term. So how is this being funded?
Yeah, I think it's a similar point to we've covered in previous sessions of this committee. It's the same 500 that we've talked about, but the vehicle before was a green bond, and our chief investment officer had said at the time that actually green is not the right time for bonds. So the 500, if it gets utilised, will be a combination of using the GLA's own cash balances, but we will then need to borrow, but we'll use the flexibility of some of the 90 million to subsidise the rates to encourage parts of the group that have been potentially reluctant to borrow or maybe close to their borrowing limits. So we subsidise the interest rate through the 90, but the 500 is either a combination of, if we've got the cash, we'll use our own balance, or we'll borrow on their behalf and then use the 90 to help supplement it.
So use the 90 to subsidise the interest rates because they're higher than you, and would that be borrowing from the Public Works Loan Board or borrowing on?
That's our own money. So what we'll do is we'll subsidise the money that we've currently got, the 90 million. The 500 million depends on the timing of it. So if we've got the cash balances, we can sort of almost borrow our own, lend out at our own rate. But if we're then borrowing in its stead, we will then use our own sort of treasury investment vehicles to borrow on their behalf.
Because it does say that the organisations are going to be bidding with flexible loan terms and lower interest rates than the government's Public Works Loan Board. So that's how...
It's the 90 million that gets used to subsidise that. So we might have to sort of put a couple of percent, work out what the cost of a couple of percent is for the first few years, and then it helps prime some of those climate-related initiatives so that they start. And then we can look at structuring those debts later if green bonds are more lucrative.
Mm-hmm. So if the Mayor is now able to kind of do this and provide these loans for people to get on and do these climate supporting projects, using existing reserves and this additional borrowing, kind of subsidising using the 90 million. Why couldn't that have been done last year? Why were we waiting for always on hold for the green bond?
I think that the change in, I'm not as close to it as others have been, but I believe that the announcement was made on the basis that the green bonds was the right vehicle, but the market's changed quite a lot in that period. So if you recall 15 to 10 months ago, there was quite a lot of turbulence, and it just wasn't the right time to then use that. So bonds might have been mooted to the Mayor previously. Things took a downward turn, and very quickly, I think at one of the ones of these committees, we changed the term from being about bonds to being a green financing. We've been working on the green financing, but also trying to make sure that we've got the right criteria for which schemes come forward, and ensuring that there's both payback in terms of not just financially, but also from a carbon perspective. So not every scheme would get the go-ahead. And it took a while to get the governance arrangements around and to get the criteria right. I think those...
Sorry, are you saying the governance criteria around whether it's funded through green bond or funded the way it's now being funded?
That was the first element, which was what's the financial vehicle, but then the other one was what are the terms in which schemes would we go for, and the climate budgeting work helped to sort of generate a bit of a pipeline to identify what wasn't funded, what was funded, what things would attract government grant, and there was the PDSC, the Public Decarbonisation Scheme. There were bids in process for that. So before we start using GLA funds, if government's already funding something, we had to wait to see what schemes were going to attract that. So there was some time that had to be spent to wait to see what was coming through. Meanwhile, we were developing the pipelines through the climate budgeting, which didn't really conclude till February 23.
So are you confident now that there is a pipeline of projects that are appropriate to be funded through this current vehicle?
I'm confident that the mechanisms are in place now to allow for a pipeline to be developed. The pipeline isn't very long yet. There is obviously you've got all the schemes that are published under the unfunded parts of the climate budget. You could argue all of that makes the pipeline, but it doesn't mean they all meet the criteria. So yes, there is a pipeline. Yes, I'm confident that there is something for us that we're working through. It's taking a while sometimes for some of those schemes to be bid for, to come in as a business case in its proper sense for the credit committee to look at and assess whether they are suitable for investment. So we've had a couple that we've now supported. We're pushing for more, and we have our regular climate budget working group. There's NVIG, there's this Green Finance Credit Committee. So there's a number of various groups that are now in place that are constantly pushing for these schemes. We're now starting to talk to the boroughs as well. So we're running some workshops for those in the next week or two. So that will also encourage wider organisations also to come forward.
So I think the bit that just feels a bit worrying about this is the pace. We're talking about a climate emergency, and quite properly you're doing climate budgeting, and that is, that's really important work. You are looking seriously at how to decarbonise all the different, across all the functional bodies, decarbonise, throughout the GLA budget process. But this doesn't feel like a kind of an energetic pipeline ready to be put into action using this money that is available. And this money is available. It was available last year, and it just feels like it needs a bit more oomph behind it to actually get some of these projects out the door so that people start benefiting from whether it's better insulated homes or more solar panels or whatever it is. But, all of that work is things that will help the economy in London, it'll create more jobs, and it'll help London meet its climate commitments. So it just feels a bit a little bit slow, a little bit lethargic, although it's very good and reassuring to hear that you've got good governance processes in place. But I'm not sure that that's really a question, so I don't know if you've got anything you further want to just add.
Well, I think I could almost have repeated it exactly the same way you just did. Believe me, it's not lethargic. I'm hopefully, myself, along with half a dozen individuals now across the group, are trying to inject some of that dynamism that you're asking for. I believe it was slow to start. I won't start pointing the finger or anything. I just think maybe it was confusing as to who could go where and what. That, I think, it's taken a while to sort out. It has been sorted out. The climate budgeting, as you'll find out soon, is now being incorporated into the quarterly monitoring, and that will then provide a place also for myself, along with a couple of others in the GLA, to challenge across the group to ask what's going on, especially with the unfunded areas. So when people complain that something's not funded, I keep reminding them, well, where's your bid then?
Yep.
I'm not. Again, some of it was around the fear of adding to borrowing, and again, I've said, well, we can subsidise that. So we're sort of we're running out of road of excuses, but it's not lethargic from where I'm sitting. Believe me, it's just taking a little while longer than I've wanted to get people excited about it as I've been.
Well, hopefully you can make it as clear as possible to people how straightforward it is to bid for this money for good projects and actually get some of them out the door. I just have one final little request, which was about consistency of naming the different pots, because there was a climate change reserve. I think previously that was the Green Finance Reserve. There's also a London Green Fund Reserve, and it would be really helpful. I don't know if these are all different pots or whether they're renamed pots, but it would be helpful to just maintain consistency, or if names change, to put brackets previously, whatever the previous name was, just so that we can track things more easily.
Yeah, I agree. We'll try and bring a bit more consistency. The Green Finance Reserve is the Climate Emergency Funding Reserve, and I'll take that back to base and just sort of ask people, please don't change the names until I'm aware of it, because I got confused when I was looking at them too. So
yeah.
I'm not quite sure how the name changes have happened, but that's fine. We'll have some consistency.
That's appreciated.
There is a separate one, which is the one you've mentioned, which I wasn't really aware. It's not a massive amount of money, but I'll just try and find out why that's sitting somewhere separate and why that can't be rolled in. It might have a reason why it's sitting separate. It's about 1.5 million, but most of it is the 90 million called Climate Emergency Funding Reserve, which was also called the Green Bond, and it's the same. It's the same. It's the 90 million.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, so Member Russell. So just for my own, by the way, you said the road of excuses is running out. My experiences of roads of excuses in politics is they run much longer than you ever anticipate. Just in terms of this green bond, though, just so that I'm clear then, so the money announced, the 500 million Green Finance Fund announced roughly a fortnight ago, is basically the same thing that was from early 2002, but now instead of a bond, it's just sort of internally funded. And what makes it green, this is an interesting question to me, what makes it green as opposed to any other colour, is that the £90 million reserve you've talked about, of whatever that happens to currently be called, that £90 million subsidises the interest rate. So if your internal project meets the criteria, it can then get access to funding at a lower interest rate. That's what makes it green money as opposed to any other kind of money. Is that roughly right?
Yes, roughly right. And it's for those type of investments. That's what makes it green. It's for initiatives that help London's air, basically, not for something else.
Or presumably, is this just climate projects or air quality projects as well? Sorry, that's a very big question to open up with 6 minutes left in the meeting, so I will withdraw that question.
Let's just say it's green-related stuff.
Yes. Just a couple of final very quick questions from me, also following actually, I remember Russell's theme about things being clear. So at the beginning of her questions, there was some dispute about or confusion about GLA core reserves versus GLA group reserves. I think it would be really useful, and from what you said, it might be that you're intending to anyway, to publish all of the GLA core reserves and all of the GLA group reserves just in your normal report. I know we had to request the group reserves, which for those people who are struggling to follow, the core reserves are GLA's own money, and the GLA group reserves are money that we keep for, say, for Transport for London, for MOPAC and so on. If we could just have all of those published together, which it sounded like you were intending to do.
They are, and they're also in the statement of accounts, which I'd sent to the committee officer as well. So they're all on one list. The only difference was that
I think between you and me, this might secretly be his question, so that he doesn't have to request it from you, and you can just publish it automatically.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they are all published, so just so you are aware. I think it's just where that line is, where I just think the climate one should have, it's our thing to fix, not yours.
Yep.
We should have probably moved that climate one into the group level.
That makes sense. Okay. And then finally, obviously some of these reserves are effectively already committed. You've spoken about how some of them are effectively earmarked for a project and it's about managing cash flow. Others of them are potentially unallocated. Could you supply us with a breakdown of which ones out of the group and the core reserves, which ones or how much of each one perhaps is already earmarked for something and how much is effectively money that is there but with nothing specifically allocated to it? Is that possible?
In terms of to follow up, or do you want it now?
We've got 5 minutes left in the meeting, and that sounds like a detailed answer.
No, it's too detailed. I was going to say it's
please.
Happy to supply details in writing.
Very much so. And also, just very quickly, in that same letter that you're going to write, there's 100 million in the Transport Services Funding Reserve and 134 million in the Environmental Improvement Reserve. My understanding is those balances are forecast to remain until 2026. So I'd be interested in an explanation of why we have such a lot of money for transport initiatives, which we are apparently not intending to spend on the face of it.
I would actually just to say, when you see the budget guidance that comes out in the coming week, I'm changing the way that we report on reserves, in that up till now we only showed forecast movement in reserves if there was a signed off mayoral decision. I'm changing that now to say if we're aware of a commitment, we should reflect it in the forecast movement in reserves, because otherwise it looks like there's no plans to spend it when there might be.
That sounds like a really excellent initiative. I would very much welcome that, because there's this grey area of things that everybody knows, in inverted commas, are planned, but they haven't officially been announced.
I would be surprised if both those amounts are still there by March 2026, but I'm not aware of what the plans to spend them are just yet.
Okay, excellent. Well, in that case, I would like to thank our guests, Enver and Tim and Andrew, for the final section of our meeting. Thank you for attending and for answering our questions. You three are free to go. We have a couple, you can see everyone packing their bags. You have a couple of very, very short items, but you are free to go. So can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? And can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with the party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? A couple of quick items then. Item 5, can I ask the committee to note the quarterly monitoring reports? Item 6, can I ask the committee to note the report on payments over £250? Item 7, can I ask the committee to note its work programme and meeting dates for the coming year? Noted. Item 8, next meeting of the committee will be held on the 21st of September 2023, 10 a.m. in the chamber here in City Hall. I have no urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everyone.